Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
The Death Mask by H.D. Everett. Yes, that is a portrait of my wife. It is considered to be a good likeness, but of course she was older looking towards the last. Enderby and I were on our way to the smoking room after dinner, and the picture hung on the staircase. We had been chums at school a quarter of a century ago, and later on at college, but I had spent the last decade out of England. I returned to find my friend a widower of 4 years' standing, and a good job too, I thought to myself when I heard of it, for I had no great liking for the late Gloriana. Probably the sentiment, or want of sentiment, had been mutual. She did not smile on me, but I doubt if she smiled on any of poor Tom Enderby's bachelor cronies. The picture was certainly like her. She was a fine woman, with aquiline features and a cold eye. The artist had done the features justice, and the eye, which seemed to keep a steely watch on all the comings and goings of the house out of which she had died. We had made only a brief pause before the portrait, and then went on. The smoking room was an apartment built out at the back of the house by a former owner, and shut off by double doors to serve as a nursery. Mrs. Enderby had no family, and she disliked the smell of tobacco, so the big room was made over to Tom's pipes and cigars, and if Tom's friends wanted to smoke, they must smoke there, or not at all. I remembered the room and the rule, but I was not prepared to find it still existing. I had expected to light my after-dinner cigar over the dessert dishes, now there was no presiding lady to consider. We were soon installed in a couple of deep-cushioned chairs before a good fire. I thought Enderby breathed more freely when he closed the double doors behind us, shutting off the dull formal house and the staircase, and the picture. But he was not looking well. There hung about him an unmistakable air of depression. Could he be fretting after Gloriana? Perhaps during their married years he had fallen into the way of depending on a woman to care for him. It is pleasant enough when the woman is the right sort, but I shouldn't myself have fancied being cared for by the late Mrs. Enderby, and, if the fretting was a fact, it would be easy to find a remedy. Evelyn has a couple of pretty sisters, and we would have him over to stay at our place. "You must run down and see us," I said presently, pursuing this idea. "I want to introduce you to my wife. Can you come next week?" His face lit up with real pleasure. "I should like it of all things," he said heartily, but a qualification came after. The clouds settled back over him, and he sighed. "That is, if I can get away." "Why? What is there to hinder you?" "It may not seem much to stay for, but I've got into the way of stopping here to keep things together." He didn't look at me, but leaned over to the fender to knock the ash off his cigar. "Tell you what, Tom. You are getting hip to living by yourself. Why don't you sell the house, or let it off just as it is, and try a complete change?" "I can't sell it. I'm only the tenant for life. It was my wife's." "Well, I suppose there's nothing to prevent you letting it, or if you can't let it, you might shut it up." "There's nothing legal to prevent me." The emphasis was too fine to attract notice, but I remembered it after. "Then, my dear fellow, why not? Knock about a bit and see the world. But to my thinking, the best thing you could do would be to marry again." He shook his head drearily. "Of course, it is a delicate matter to urge upon a widower, but you have paid the utmost ceremonial respect. 4 years, you know. The greatest stickler for propriety would deem it ample. It isn't that, Dick. I've a great mind to tell you a rather queer story." He puffed hard at his smoke and stared into the red coals in the pauses. "But I don't know what you think of it, or think of me." "Try me," I said. "I'll give you my opinion after, and you know I'm safe to confide in. I sometimes think I should feel better if I told it. It's queer enough to be laughable, but it hasn't been any laughing matter to me." He threw the stump of his cigar into the fire and turned to me, and then I saw how pale he was, and that a dew of perspiration was breaking out on his white face. I was very much of your opinion, Dick. I thought I should be happier if I married again, and I went so far as to get engaged, but the engagement was broken off, and I'm going to tell you why. My wife was some time ailing before she died, and the doctors were in consultation, but I didn't know how serious her complaint was till the last. Then they told me there was no hope, as coma had set in. But it was possible, even probable, that there would be a revival of consciousness before death, and for this I was to hold myself ready. I dare say you'll write me down a coward, but I dreaded the revival. I was ready to pray that she might pass away in her sleep. I knew she held exalted views about the marriage tie, and I felt sure if there were any last words, she would exact a pledge. I could not, at such a moment, refuse to promise, and I didn't want to be tied. You will recollect that she was my senior. I was about to be left a widower in middle life, and in the natural course of things I had a good many years before me, you see? My dear fellow, I don't think a promise so extorted ought to bind you. It isn't fair. Wait and hear me. I was sitting here, miserable enough, as you may suppose, when the doctor came to fetch me to her room. Mrs. Enderby was conscious and had asked for me, but he particularly begged me not to agitate her in any way, lest pain should return. She was lying, stretched out in the bed, looking already like a corpse. "Tom," she said, "they tell me I'm dying, and there is something I want you to promise." I groaned in spirit. It was all up with me, I thought. But she went on. "When I am dead and in my coffin, I want you to cover my face with your own hands. Promise me this." It was not in the very least what I expected. Of course I promised. "I want you to cover my face with a particular handkerchief on which I set a value. When the time comes, open the cabinet to the right of the window, and you will find it in the third drawer from the top. You cannot mistake it, for it is the only thing in the drawer." That was every word she said, if you believe me, Dick. She just sighed and shut her eyes as if she was going to sleep, and she never spoke again. 3 or 4 days later they came again to ask me if I wished to take a last look, as the undertaker's men were about to close the coffin. I felt a great reluctance, but it was necessary I should go. She looked as if made of wax, and was colder than ice to the touch. I opened the cabinet, and there, just as she had said, was a large handkerchief of very fine cambric lying by itself. It was embroidered with a monogram device in all 4 corners, and was not of a sort I had ever seen her use. I spread it out and laid it over the dead face. And then what happened was rather curious. It seemed to draw down over the features and cling to them, to nose and mouth and forehead, and the shut eyes, till it became a perfect mask. My nerves were shaken, I suppose. I was seized with horror, and flung back the covering sheet, hastily quitting the room, and the coffin was closed that night. Well, she was buried, and I put up a monument which the neighbourhood considered handsome. As you see, I was bound by no pledge to abstain from marriage, and though I knew what would have been her wish, I saw no reason why I should regard it. And some months after, a family of the name of Ashcroft came to live at the Leasos, and they had a pretty daughter. I took a fancy to Lucy Ashcroft the first time I saw her, and it was soon apparent that she was well inclined to me. She was a gentle, yielding little thing, not the superior style of woman, not at all like— I made no comment, but I could well understand that in his new matrimonial venture Tom would prefer a contrast. But I thought I had a very good chance of happiness with her, and I grew fond of her, very fond of her indeed. Her people were of the hospitable sort, and they encouraged me to go to the Leasos, dropping in when I felt inclined. It did not seem as if they would be likely to put obstacles in our way. Matters progressed, and I made up my mind one evening to walk over there and declare myself. I had been up to town the day before, and came back with a ring in my pocket, rather a fanciful design of double hearts, but I thought Lucy would think it pretty, and would let me put it on her finger. I went up to change into dinner things, and making myself as spruce as possible, and coming to the conclusion before the glass that I was not such a bad figure of a man after all, and that there was not much grey in my hair. Aye, Dick, you may smile. It is a good bit greyer now. I had taken out a clean handkerchief and thrown the one carried through the day crumpled on the floor. I don't know what made me turn to look there, but once it caught my eye, I stood staring at it as if spellbound. The handkerchief was moving, Dick. I swear it. Rapidly altering in shape, puffing up here and there as if blown by wind, spreading and moulding itself into the features of a face. And what face should it be but the death mask of Gloriana, which I had covered in the coffin 11 months before? To say I was horror-stricken conveys little of the feeling that possessed me. I snatched up the rag of cambric and flung it on the fire, and it was nothing but a rag in my hand, and in another moment no more than a blackened tinder on the bar of the grate. There was no face below. Of course not, I said. It was a mere hallucination. You were cheated by an excited fancy. You may be sure I told myself all that, and more. And I went downstairs and tried to pull myself together with a dram. But I was curiously upset, and for that night at least, I found it impossible to play the wooer. The recollection of the death mask was too vivid. It would have come between me and Lucy's lips. The effect wore off, however. In a day or two I was bold again, and as much disposed to smile at my folly as you are at this moment. I proposed, and Lucy accepted me, and I put on the ring. Ashcroft père was graciously pleased to approve of the settlements I offered, and Ashcroft mère promised to regard me as a son. And during the first 48 hours of our engagement there was not a cloud to mar the blue. I proposed on a Monday, and on Wednesday I went again to dine and spend the evening with just their family party. Lucy and I found our way afterwards into the back drawing-room, which seemed to be made over to us by tacit understanding. Anyway, we had it to ourselves. And as Lucy sat on the settee busy with her work, I was privileged to sit beside her, close enough to watch the careful stitches she was setting under which the pattern grew. She was embroidering a square of fine linen to serve as a tea-cloth, and it was intended for a present for a friend. She was anxious, she told me, to finish it in the next few days, ready for dispatch, but I was somewhat impatient of her engrossment in the work. I wanted her to look at me while we talked, and to be permitted to hold her hand. I was making plans for a tour we would take together after Easter, arguing that 8 weeks spent in preparation was enough for any reasonable bride. Lucy was easily entreated. She laid aside the linen square on the table at her elbow. I held her fingers captive, but her eyes wandered from my face as she was still deliciously shy. All at once she exclaimed. Her work was moving. There was going to be a face in it. Did I not see? I saw, indeed. It was the Gloriana death mask forming there, as it had formed in my handkerchief at home. The marked nose and chin, the severe mouth, the mould of forehead almost complete. I snatched it up and dropped it over the back of the couch. It did look like a face, I allowed, but never mind it, darling. I want you to attend to me. Something of this sort, I said, I hardly know what, for my blood was running cold. Lucy pouted. She wanted to dwell on the marvel, and my impatient action had displeased her. I went on talking wildly, being afraid of pauses, but the psychological moment had gone by. I felt I did not carry her with me as before. She hesitated over my persuasions. The forecast of a Sicilian honeymoon had ceased to charm. By and by she suggested that Mrs. Ashcroft would expect us to rejoin the circle in the other room, and perhaps I would pick up her work for her, still with a slight air of offence. I walked round the settee to recover the luckless piece of linen, but she turned also, looking over the back, so the same instant we both saw. There again was the face, rigid and severe, and now the corners of the cloth were tucked under, completing the form of the head. And that was not all. Some white drapery had been improvised and extended beyond it on the floor, presenting the complete figure laid out straight and stiff, ready for the grave. Lucy's alarm was excusable. She shrieked aloud, shriek upon shriek, and immediately an indignant family of Ashcrofts rushed in through the half-drawn portiere which divided the two rooms, demanding the cause of her distress. Meanwhile, I had fallen upon the puffed-out form and destroyed it. Lucy's embroidery composed the head. The figure was ingeniously contrived out of a large Turkish bath sheet, brought in from one of the bedrooms. No one knew how or when. I held up the things, protesting their innocence, while the family were stabbing me through and through with looks of indignation, and Lucy was sobbing in her mother's arms. She might have been foolish, she allowed. It did seem ridiculous now she saw what it was, but at the moment it was too dreadful. It looked so like... And here a fresh sob choked her into silence. Peace was restored at last, but plainly the Ashcrofts doubted me. The genial father stiffened, and Mrs. Ashcroft administered indirect reproofs. She hated practical joking, so she informed me. She might be wrong, and no doubt she was old-fashioned, but she had been brought up to consider it the highest degree ill-bred, and perhaps I had not considered how sensitive Lucy was, and how easily alarmed. She hoped I would take warning for the future, and that nothing of this kind would occur again. Practical joking, oh ye gods! As if it was likely that I, alone with the girl of my heart, would waste the precious hour in building up effigies of sham corpses on the floor. And Lucy ought to have known that the accusation was absurd, as I had never for a moment left her side. She did take my part when more composed, but the mystery remained, beyond explanation, of hers or mine. As for the future, I could not think of that without a failing heart. If the power arrayed against us were in truth what superstition feared, I might as well give up hope at once, for I knew there would be no relenting. I could see the whole absurdity of the thing as well as you do now, but if you put yourself in my place, Dick, you will be forced to confess that it was tragic too. I did not see Lucy the next day, and I was bound to go again to town, but we had planned to meet and ride together on the Friday morning. I was to be at the Lisos at a certain hour, and you may be sure I was punctual. The horse had already been brought round, and the groom was leading it up and down. I had hardly dismounted when she came down the steps of the porch, and I noticed at once a new look on her face, a harder set about that red mouth of hers, which was so soft and kissable. But she let me put her up on the saddle and settle her foot in the stirrup, and she was the bearer of a gracious message from her mother. I was expected to return to lunch, and Mrs. Ashcroft begged us to be punctual, as a friend who had stayed the night with them would be leaving immediately after. "You'll be pleased to meet her, I think," said Lucy, leaning forward to pat her horse. "I find she knows you very well. It is Miss Kingsworthy." Now, Miss Kingsworthy was a school friend of Gloriana's, who used now and then to visit us here. I was not aware that she and the Ashcrofts were acquainted, but, as I have said, they had only recently come into the neighbourhood as tenants of the Lisos. I had no opportunity to express pleasure or the reverse, for Lucy was riding on and putting her horse to a brisk pace. It was some time before she drew rein and again admitted conversation. We were descending a steep hill, and the groom was following at a discreet distance behind, far enough to be out of earshot. Lucy looked very pretty on horseback, but this is by the way. The mannish hat suited her, and so did the habit fitting closely to her shape. "Tom," she said, and again I noticed that new hardness in her face. "Tom, Miss Kingsworthy tells me your wife did not wish you to marry again, and she made you promise her that you would not. Miss Kingsworthy was quite astonished to hear that you and I were engaged. Is this true?" I was able to tell her that it was not, that my wife had never asked, and I had never given her any such pledge. I allowed she disliked second marriages, in certain cases, and perhaps she had made some remark to that effect to Miss Kingsworthy. It was not unlikely. And then I appealed to her. Surely she would not let a mischief-maker's tittle-tattle come between her and me. I thought her profile looked less obdurate, but she would not let her eyes meet mine as she answered, "Of course not, if that was all, and I doubt if I would have heeded it, only that it seemed to fit in with something else. Tom. It was very horrible what we saw on Wednesday evening, and don't be angry, but I asked Miss Kingsworthy what your wife was like. I didn't tell her why I wanted to know." "What has that to do with it?" I demanded, stoutly enough, but alas, I was too well aware. "She told me Mrs. Enderby was handsome, but she had very marked features and was severe-looking when she did not smile, a high forehead, a Roman nose, and a decided chin. Tom, the face in the cloth was just like that. Did you not see?" Of course I protested. My darling, what nonsense! I saw it looked a little like a face, but I pulled it to pieces at once because you were frightened. Why, Lucy, I shall have you turning into a spiritualist if you take up these fancies. "No," she said, "I do not want to be anything foolish. I've thought it over, and if it happens only once, I've made up my mind to believe it a mistake and forget it. But if it comes again, if it goes on coming—" Here she shuddered and turned white. "Oh, Tom, I could not. I could not." That was the ultimatum. She liked me as much as ever. She even owned to a warmer feeling, but she was not going to marry a haunted man. Well, I suppose I can't blame her. I might have given the same advice in another fellow's case, though in my own I felt it hard. I'm close to the end now, so I shall need tax your patience very little longer. A single chance remained. Gloriana's power, whatever its nature and however derived, might have been so spent in the previous efforts that she could effect no more. I clung to this shred of hope, and did my best to play the part of the light-hearted lover, the sort of companion Lucy expected, who would shape himself to her mood. But I was conscious that I played it ill. The ride was a lengthy business. Lucy's horse cast a shoe, and it was impossible to change the saddle onto the groom's hack or my own mare, as neither of them had been trained to the habit. We were bound to return at foot pace, and didn't reach the Lisos until 2:00. Lunch was over. Mrs. Ashcroft had set out for the station driving Miss Kingsworthy, but some cutlets were keeping hot for us, so we were informed, and could be served immediately. We went off at once into the dining room, as Lucy was hungry, and she took off her hat and laid it on a side table. She said the close fit of it made her headache. The cutlets had been misrepresented. They were lukewarm, but Lucy made a good meal of them, and the fruit tart, which followed, very much at her leisure. Heaven knows I would not have grudged her so much as a mouthful, but that luncheon was an ordeal I cannot readily forget. The servant absented himself, having seen us serve, and then my troubles began. The tablecloth seemed alive at the corner which was between us. It rose in waves, as if puffed up by wind, though the window was fast shut against any wandering airs. I tried to seem unconscious, tried to talk as if no horror of apprehension was filling all my mind, while I was flattening out the bewitched damask with a grasp I hardly dared relax. Lucy rose at last, saying she must change her dress. Occupied with the cloth, it had not occurred to me to look round or keep watch on what might be going on in another part of the room. The hat on the side table had been tilted over sideways, and in that position it was made to crown another presentation of the face. What it was made of this time I can't say. Probably a serviette, as several lay about. The linen material, of whatever sort, was again moulded into the perfect form, but this time the mouth showed humour and appeared to relax in a grim smile. Lucy shrieked and dropped into my arms in a swoon, a real genuine fainting fit, out of which she was brought round with difficulty after I had summoned the help of doctors. I hung about miserably till her safety was assured, and then went as miserably home. Next morning I received a cutting little note from my mother-in-law elect, in which she returned the ring, and informed me the engagement must be considered at an end. Well, Dick, You now know why I do not marry. And what have you to say? You know, if you go to my Patreon, www.patreon.com/Barcud, Barcud, there are 500 and many stories for you to listen to, and a link to my Google Drive where you can download the whole lot completely ad-free. Good deal, I think. Well, that was The Death Mask by H.D. Everett. Now, when I began to read that, because it's written from a male point of view, I thought she was a bloke, but she ain't a bloke. She's a lady. She's Henrietta Dorothy Everett. And I'm going to tell you something about her. I've just come back off my walk for 13 days, walking the Offa's Dyke, which is the Dark Age barrier built by King Offa of Mercia to keep the Welsh out. So it's still the boundary between England and Wales. So I walked about 126 miles. Now, I've been keeping my Patreons entertained with pictures and stories from my walk. But otherwise, if you're just listening to me on YouTube or on the podcast, you won't know any of that. I've been away, and it's weird coming back because I'm a little bit dislocated. So now this is me getting back into the saddle. I had some videos and some podcast episodes queued up to go out while I was away, and Imogen did a compilation on YouTube of my own stories. So people didn't know I was away, and people think I did the compilation, but I didn't. Young Imogen did. Thank you very much, Imogen. Anyway, back to work now. Enough of that. Enjoying yourself with the rain and the sheep and the horses and the red kites and everything. Let me tell you about Henrietta Dorothea Everett, born 1851, died 1923. Speak, enunciate clearly, Tony. I've just been talking to myself as I've been walking over these hills, so I haven't had practice enunciating. Anyway, she was born Henrietta Dorothea Huskisson, it's a funny name, in Gillingham in Kent in early 1851 and baptised there on the 4th of March that year, so she's probably born end of February. So her father, John Huskisson, was a first lieutenant in the Royal Marines. Now, lieutenant, Americans say lieutenant. The Royal Navy say something like lieutenant. I don't know what they say, but they don't say it. But of course, it's placeholder in French, lieutenant. It's French, isn't it? I wondered if the Royal Marines, being part of the Royal Navy, would go with the Army or the Navy, so I looked it up. And they go with the Army, as it turns out. So I'm told by my research, if anybody's been in the Royal Marines, they'll be able to tell me different. So there you go. So you've got middle-class solidity and military discipline, and she becomes a late Victorian respectable person. Her mother, Julia Nee Lovett, disappears into the record after the bare naming in parish and genealogical sources. So basically, mother is named there. That's the last we hear of her mother. Of her early life and her days in Gillingham, got not much. In that gap, critics sometimes try to install a theory. The more honest conclusion is that she steps into view fully formed, an adult woman of her time, for whom writing would become late, both a profession and a way of thinking through the uncanny edges of that time. So basically what we've got is, and this happens a lot, you know, I find this, I'm doing a lot of research on Dark Age Britain, hence sort of King Offa, and there'll be a basic sentence in the Historia Brittonum or the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles or, you know, Simeon of Durham, and people will construct elaborate theories on the basis of, you know, oh, this must mean, and then you have a whole different theory. So where we lack information, we just make stuff up generally, and this is what happened to the people who've attempted the biography of Henrietta Dorothea Everett. She was married when she was 18 in 1869 to a man from Derby, who was a solicitor called, which is kind of lawyer, Isaac Edward Everett. He died in 1904, and she had at least 3 children. See, the stuff we've got is vague. She had a son, Arthur Huskisson Everett. That was really common in those days, if you ever done any family history, for the children to bear the mother's maiden name as a second or third name. Anyway, Arthur Huskisson, her son, became her executor and principal heir. She has 2 daughters who we know very little about, but they appear in the census, if you want to do the family research, as part of the small, solid domestic unit. For several decades after her marriage, Everett appears to have lived a life expected of a professional man's wife in the later 19th century. Domestic responsibilities first, intellectual life, if any, folded into private reading and the social duties of a provincial bourgeois family. Interesting, because this story touches on that. After Isaac Everett's death in 1904, she becomes a widow and the novelist. Now, the interesting thing about Victorian women was if they were single or if they were widows, they could operate as, I'm going to say, people. They had rights. But if they were just the wife, they had no rights really. And so being a widow actually was potentially better for women. They could invest. They could act as a man. Look, don't shoot me down. I'm not a Victorian. So in the 1911 census, she's marked as a widow and a novelist and a woman of private means living independently. Herself, she died 19 years later at the old vicarage Weston-on-Trent in Derbyshire, and she left an estate of around £4,850, which was not insignificant in those days, to Isaac Arthur, her son. So she is a successful professional writer working not in London, but out in the sticks, as it were, in Derbyshire, very nice county. The literary life that lay between those. So what we've got is, as I was saying before, we have some bare information, and a lot of the stuff is extrapolated from that rather than known. But we do know some things. So she didn't publish fiction, as far as we know, until 1896, when she was 44 or 45. At that time, she started writing under a male pseudonym, not uncommon again, in line with the theories we've been talking about, Theo Douglas. And we know this from, George Eliot and the Brontes, I think, originally wrote under male names. Somebody's going to shoot me down if I've got that wrong, but I've been shot down before. I've survived. So there you go. And you can talk about the great, and we could talk about the great injustice of this. I'm just noting it. She produced about 22 books with no fewer than 17 different publishers, moving from William Blackwood and Sons to Smith, Elder, Hurst and Blacker. So she's a fairly driven woman, Methuen, Martin, Secker, Heath, Cranton and Ousley and others. The publishing pattern, short runs with multiple houses, is diagnostic of a solidly popular author of the period, reliable sales across different lists, but no single firm that sought to lock her in as a flagship property. So she isn't sort of the J.K. Rowling of her time. She's more like a jobbing writer who's doing all right. She's doing all right. She's doing better than most, and it's her living. And there are a lot of women like this at this time writing, and we've covered a lot of their work on the podcast. Of course, Elizabeth Gaskell is a big name, but thinking of Charlotte Riddell and people like that, who produce lots of stuff, and Margaret Oliphant. There's loads of them. So there we go. So her first book, Euras, a Mystery, 1896, she, under the name of Theo Douglas, issued by Blackwood. It's an Egyptological fantasy in which a revived mummy, occult rituals and hint of scientific method overlap. You've got to understand that this time there was a big fascination with ancient Egypt and archaeology, mummification, and the porous boundary between science and the occult. And we've talked about that at length in other podcasts. She would return to this borderland repeatedly. In 1900, she turns on hypnotism, spiritualism, and an automaton animated by the displaced soul of a conjurer's daughter. Sounds good, doesn't it? I haven't read it. 102, 1907, explores spiritualism and the splitting of identity under occult pressure. So I'm saying she's maybe interested in these themes, but these are kind of... So is she writing to market? One thing that writers are encouraged to do to make money these days is to write to market. So if it's billionaire, werewolf, alpha, romantasy, that's a polite word for it, mommy porn they call it as well, then that's what you should write. Or lit RPG was a genre I did a bit of. I enjoyed writing, which is basically writing a book as if it's within a video game. I think it's probably still popular. That I did all right from that at one point. I used a pseudonym as well, Galen Wolfe, if you want to look him up. and I did 2 or 3 series there. Anyway, writing to market. So the big issue with her is, it's not a big issue, but just an observation, is she writing to market, or is this actually what she's interested in? Or do the two helpfully coincide? So in Malevola, 1914, she has a masseuse who's also a psychic vampire, draining her client's vitality under the guise of therapeutic touch. These are not occult romances in the melodramatic modern sense so much as fin de siècle thought experiments in which the seance room, the consulting room, and laboratory blur. It sounds great, this stuff. She also wrote, under Theo Douglas, strict historical fictions, which, historical, you could argue that, I mean, people do argue that, and they're probably right, that Walter Scott invented the historical novel, although he was very much he's certainly the German, the Schiller, Ritter German romances influenced him. He liked them, although he backed away from them because he thought they were a bit vulgar by the end, because they were like the Billionaire Alpha, but without the smut, and just a little bit of a suggestion of it. So she wrote one called Golden Trust, 1905, set during the French Revolution, Northumberland and Paris in 1792, the storming of the Tuileries, Robespierre and Dupleix household in the background, and works through questions of loyalty, trust and cross-channel entanglement. Think of the Scarlet Pimpernel. Cousin Hugh, 1910, moves to the south coast during the Napoleonic Wars, following smuggling operations and escaped prisoners of war. This is popular fiction, White Webs, a romance of Sussex. They're long set against the Jacobite rebellion. So she did loads of stories. So, but all they've all gone, and where she has remained is her weird stories, her ghost stories. So in 1918, The Pipers of Mallory, as Theo Douglas, was reprinted in Uncanny Stories. In 1920, Philip Allen published The Death Mask and Other Ghosts under the name of H.D. Everett, a final valedictory collection of stories drawing together work written across the war and post-war years, the First War, that is. The Death Mask, with its widower haunted by its dead wife's features appearing in nearby cloth, is a small study in obsessive haunting. We're going to talk about that. And the next story in the collection is Parson Clench. You can get these if you go on, I think I've got this on Gutenberg, either Gutenberg or the archive.org library. No, I didn't. That's not true. I've got a copy of it. I've got the Wordsworth copy. What was I saying then? There's a whole bunch of them. And they disappeared, really. She's mentioned in The Guide to Supernatural Fiction, 1983, and slagged off, as we say, in The Shadow of the Attic, 2000, by Neil Wilson. I think as The Woman's Weird is coming out, the Handheld Press, who do lovely books, they did a volume which I've got, Woman's Weird, Strange Stories by Women, 1890-1940. She appears in that, and then the Wordsworth, Wordsworth editions. They're very good, cheap books of collections of unknown authors. I've got a whole bunch of them which I picked up as a job lot in a second-hand bookshop in Aberystwyth. So that was 2006, The Crimson Blind and Other Stories. So that's the book that I've got. I've got a bunch, and how I came to read this one was I'd come back and I was thinking, I want something that's not too long, and there we are. Anyway, let's move to the story itself. The Death Mask, first published in 1920. In that book we talked of The Death Mask and Other Ghosts, a collection of 10 supernatural tales, actually issued under her own name, not Theo Douglas. So let's think about it. On the surface, it's a carefully constructed tale of supernatural ambiguity in the tradition of Henry James and Oliver Onions. A first-person frame narrator reports the testimony of his friend Tom Enderby, whose courtship of a young woman named Lucy is systematically destroyed by the appearance of his dead wife's face in every piece of white linen that surrounds a new relationship. The story maintains, with considerable technical skill, an unresolved tension between supernatural fact and psychological projection. This is why I mention Henry James, Turn of the Screw, and Oliver Onions, The Beckoning Fair One, whereby in both those stories you don't really know if the protagonist is going mad or not. Turn of the Screw is formally a frame story, so it begins with a frame and ends with a frame. It's Christmas Eve and somebody's telling the story of a woman he knew, who he wasn't in love with, but he knew. But the bulk of Turn of the Screw is portrayed first person by the governess, as you know. I think Beckoning Fair One, as I recall, is not a frame story. But the frame in this one is, we don't know whether this is a hysteria, or there is no proof of the ghost of the hauntings, and they could be, it could equally be. So there is this late Victorian psychological ghost story. So what was happening? We moved from the high Gothic ghosts in chains and revenants, and we haven't reached the 20th century reality of ghosts again, where ghosts and monsters are real. And we go through a period, not in all stories from this period, but psychology. Freud was starting to write, and this idea of that the world as we see it is filtered through our psychology rather than being objectively real, is coming up. And so I think I mention that because I think that's what's going on. So Dick, it's Tom and Dick. Tom, Dick, no Harry. And Dick is a returned friend who's been out of England for 10 years. Often they are in it, so they haven't seen him for 10 years. This is why he hasn't seen him. And he knew the wife, and he didn't really like her. And Gloriana, great name. The Queen, of course, Queen Elizabeth I, Gloriana, that's what she was known as. She is not painted in particularly warm light, really, as she's not a very nice person, we don't think. And he doesn't seem to have missed her much. He didn't seem to have liked his wife. I think that's really important for the story. But, Tom is like, oh, it's just a hallucination. And that's sorry, Dick, that is to say. Dick, that's Dick's job. So this is as I was saying, this idea of psychology. Is there a ghost? Or is it insanity? Or, Guy de Maupassant's story, The Hauler, 1887, is a similar story in that we're not sure whether it's a ghost or it's somebody going mad, although I think probably in The Hauler, it is somebody going mad. But you see, there is a sort of a genre increasingly of its time with an interest in psychology. Are ghosts real, or are they figments of our hysterical mind? The ambiguous ghost story. So it's a thing, Of course, if we go into psychology, and I often talk about this, and I don't want to labour it too much, is this idea of the return of the repressed. So Freud's theory is that we things that are too painful, that we don't acknowledge, we don't want to live in our conscious mind, we put them in the cupboard of our unconscious and we hide it away. But his idea was that you can't. The pressure builds up, this hydraulic metaphor. The pressure builds up and we have to let it out. Again, I remember when I was doing psychology, we would often talk about how we see the human mind according to the technology of the time. So in Freud's time, it was basically there is a pressure building up. You can't do anything about it. You've got to let the pressure out. You let the pressure out through talking about it. You have a catharsis and everything's fine. That isn't true, as it turns out. And then when I was studying psychology in the early 2000s, the metaphor then was the brain as a computer. And we had cognitive psychology, and it was basically looking at the brain as an information processing device. And I don't think we do that anymore. I think probably we're looking at it as AI or something now, which AI, of course, LLMs are just basically very clever, huge predictive text machines. And so basically I think the metaphor now for the brain will be some kind of predictive text machine. So it's an interesting thought, isn't it? But so behind that slight digression is the mind is none of those things. Those are metaphors, and I think, again, old Ian McGilchrist stepping in here, the left brain likes to systemize, the left hemisphere likes to systemize, and it mistakes its representation for the truth. So the danger is, of course, Freud thought, he was so convinced that the brain operated like a steam engine that he was trapped by that. And so, in the 2000s, when they thought the brain was some kind of computer of its time, they really believed it was. And so the danger is if we come to believe that the brain is simply a very clever predictive text or predictive bit machine, we will be trapped with that idea and we will come to take it as reality when of course it's simply a model and an imperfect model. Anyway, so So if this haunting is a return of the repressed, and I think it's a stretch to say this, to be honest, what is repressed? What is Tom hiding from? I think we could make a tentative argument that he's hiding from his inauthenticity. Now, I've got to be careful because I'm really interested in being honest and being authentic to yourself. And so that is my model. And I've got to be aware that I might be as trapped in my model as Freud is in his, you know. So I'm thinking, and you take it with a pinch of salt. Sorry, I just knocked the microphone. Take it with a pinch of salt, you know, because it could be that this is just me and I'm a bit hung up on my own theories, you know. But I think I see this story as a man who's not being honest with himself. Okay. That's what's repressed. I'm absolutely prepared to be corrected on that because I'm not 100% convinced I'm right. But anyway, let's go on with the linen. I think the linen's really interesting. So the most original and powerful element, remember, she is a woman, of Everett's story is her choice of haunting medium. Gloriana's face does not appear in mirrors or windows or the generic atmospherics of the ghostly. It appears exclusively in white linen, Tom's handkerchief, Lucy's embroidery. I mean, I think the handkerchief is hers, actually. I don't think it's Tom's. It was in a drawer. Has he used it? I forget now, but it was hers. She put it away. The dining room tablecloth the ghost appears in, the Turkish bath sheet. It's not an aesthetic convenience, it's a precise material and social argument, and it is one that a woman writer of Everett's class and generation was equipped to make in a way that a male writer deploying the same imagery for atmospheric effect would not have been. So linen in a Victorian and Edwardian middle-class household was woman's work from the beginning to the end. The marking, making even, laundering, mending and storing of household linen was a specifically female responsibility, part of what a wife brought to a marriage in both literal and symbolic terms. The trousseau assembled over years, the household stock, the embroidered initials that marked ownership and transformed it. A man encountered linen as a finished product. It was a clean shirt laid out, nicely ironed, the table set, the beds made. A woman encountered it as a continuous management responsibility that began before marriage and ended only at her death, when the same category of cloth was used to wrap her body. The linen chest was one of the few domains of genuine female authority in a household where legal and financial authority resided entirely with the husband, she exercises her contact with linen through unceasing invisible labour. Of course, in a middle-class household like this, much of the labour is carried by the servants, which is a class distinction, but they will be female servants, yeah. The shroud dimension compounds this. The same material that makes the wedding dress makes the winding sheet. Gloriana's deathbed request, "Cover my face with the handkerchief," is the gesture that initiates a whole mechanism and fuses the domestic and the mortuary in a single action. She's not asking Tom to do something extraordinary, she's asking him to perform a ritual that falls entirely within the normal management of death, which was also, in this period, women's work. Who lays you out? It's the woman. Comes from the parish who lays you out. Often midwives and the laying out women were the same woman. What Everett understands and encodes in the story's material texture is that the linen chest and the coffin are not opposites. They are points on the same continuum of women's domestic labour, and the ghost who haunts through cloth is haunting through the very substance of our own working life. I think that's an interesting point. I don't think it doesn't ring 100% true. It's not the whole story with this story. There's another kind of issue about, there's a whole genre of the dead first wife stories. It's almost a subgenre that runs from the mid-19th century through to the late 1930s. Very interesting, it's bounded in time like that. The story of the dead wife whose claim on her surviving husband prevents him from finding happiness with a second woman. Its founding instance is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, 1847, where Bertha Mason is not dead, but institutionally prior, locked in the attic, legally indischargeable. So she's sort of effectively like the ghost of a woman, but haunting. You know, she haunts the relationship, the claim that cannot be cancelled by ordinary means. Bertha establishes the pattern. That was 1847. The first wife as the obstacle whose removal cannot be achieved through normal social negotiation, but only through extraordinary and violent means. it develops in a later tradition where the living inconvenient wife is actually replaced with a dead one, intensifying the problem considerably. A dead wife cannot be reasoned with, confronted, divorced, or outlasted. Also, she can't be killed. In the supernatural variant, she is acquired precisely through death, a power she never possessed in life. This is where I think Gloriana seems to be a very powerful woman, but we will go with this argument. So we have Hugh Walpole's Snow, which I've read, of course. You can find it on the podcast. 1910 is the earliest of these supernatural cases, and in some respects the most revealing. The dead wife returns not through any domestic object, but as weather, an encroaching elemental cold that draws the husband, Jacob Finch, away from his living second wife and out into the fatal exterior where the first wife waits. She won't give him up. Walpole's dead wife does not colonize the domestic interior as Gloriana does. She abolishes it, expanding her claim to the atmosphere itself. Jacob cannot flee snow. But Walpole's most disturbing insight is that Jacob does not particularly want to flee. So there are variants of theme here. He walks out into the cold with something that looks from outside like relief. The first marriage's inauthenticity included, is it implied, a kind of cold emotional safety. I'm going to say that again because clearly the relationship with the first wife is not gone. And these men in these stories have different relationships to the first wife. With Jacob Finch, we don't know, and Walpole doesn't say much about the previous relationship, so we surmise on very limited evidence. But it does appear that there's something comforting about the snow. It's almost like he's. It's easier to relax into death with her. There's something comforting about that. So we may say it's a cold emotional safety, the absence of the demand for genuine feeling that the living second wife now makes on him. So she needs him as a man, as a person, and for some reason he can't give that, and he needs to escape that demand to be a real person in life. Okay, so that may be what's inauthentic here. So I want to talk then about Edith Wharton's The Pomegranate Seed, which divides people. I love it. I see the comments, some people really don't get it at all. 1931. So in this case, Charlotte Ashby, the dead first wife, communicates with her surviving husband Kenneth through letters that arrive in handwriting his second wife Loring can see but never read. Kenneth reads them, answers them, and is progressively drawn away from the living woman until he disappears entirely. Wharton's title supplies the mythological key. The pomegranate seed that Persephone ate in the underworld bound her to return. You know the myth. So Persephone descends into the underworld. Her mother Demeter is looking for her, but she's married to Hades, and in the end they come with this deal that because she's eaten the fruit of the underworld, she must return. So it's something about the world of the dead, the world of those who have passed already, that hooks these people. These men cannot get away from this, So Kenneth has consumed something of his first marriage that now operates inside himself as a compulsion indistinguishable from will. We're even talking a little bit Arthur Schopenhauer here. I won't go into that. But Schopenhauer's great, actually. He's hard to read, so read him through somebody else. I read him through Bernardo Castro. He's got a great book on Schopenhauer. Helped me really understand it. Anyway, so in Wharton's story, going back, the dead wife's claim that Wharton requires the husband's participation. Again, Charlotte's letters must be opened, read, and answered, and that participation is what makes the horror specifically psychological as well as supernatural. Loring, the second wife, watches with complete clarity and complete helplessness because she cannot do Kenneth's how do you say that? Mourning. And he will not do it from himself. So he's unable to process. So both of these men so far we're talking about, and I suppose Jane Eyre as well, but Hugh Walpole's character, Edith Wharton's character, they have not processed, they're not done with that first marriage, that first relationship. This probably says something very much alive. This is a story after all. So I imagine that the experience of many second, not just women, but second husbands as well, is that their first partner is also somehow in the relationship. If he has not been able to, let's say he, but it could be she as well, has not been able to process this, then that relationship is not effectively dead. And we move on to Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, 1938, the fullest treatment of this. the identical effect without recourse to the supernatural at all, although it almost feels like it should be a ghost story. Yeah. Rebecca de Winter is dead before the novel begins and never appears. She is pure inscription. Her monogram on the household linen, her personality in Mrs. Danvers' devotion, her reputation in the neighbourhood's memory. The second Mrs. de Winter, who has no name of her own, which is the novel's central semiotic statement, finds every surface of her new life already covered with a prior text she cannot overwrite. The dead wife's power is the total power of total prior occupation. She's filled the role so completely that the woman attempting to succeed her, the second wife, finds no space in which to exist independently. So, in this case, with the death mask, of course, what we've got is that Lucy, young Lucy, is a promise of happiness, but can never be fulfilled because Tom has not processed, has not honestly disposed of the first relationship. The dead wife prevents her husband from being happy with the second woman, not because the dead are inherently more powerful than the living, but because happiness in a second marriage requires an honest reckoning with the first one, and these men have not performed that reckoning. The dead wife's power is not at root supernatural or psychological, it is ethical. Tom Enderby's situation makes this unusually legible because Everett, in this story, gives us key details with such telling casualness. Gloriana was his senior, the house was hers, the marriage had the shape of an arrangement made for reasons other than love, property, social settlement, convenience. Tom endured it, and when Gloriana died, his first private thought was a good job too. That's what he says. That relief is never examined, never mourned, never atoned for. It is pocketed and set aside in favour of the pursuit of Lucy. He has never admitted to himself or to anyone else that he spent years in a marriage he did not want with a woman he did not love, and that Gloriana, whatever her faults as a companion, invested her entire legal and social identity, she's just known as Mrs. Enderby in lots of things, in that same marriage with no equivalent exit available to her. Under the coverture system that shaped her married life, she had no independent property rights, no career, no public existence outside her role as Mrs. Enderby. The savage irony encoded in the story's property detail is that her own house survives her in a form that benefits him. He holds it as a tenant for life, administering her assets for his own comfort exactly as the law administered them during her lifetime. She cannot even from beyond the grave reclaim what was legally hers. Against that backdrop, the haunting is not supernatural excess, it is a logical necessity, the only channel left to a woman for whom every other instrument has been closed. The death mask returns because the admission of all this has never been made, the account has never been settled, and the ghost is not, in the final analysis, Gloriana Enderby at all. The ghost is the unlived, authentic life that the first marriage foreclosed, returning at the moment when the possibility of living genuinely presents itself, demanding that the debt be acknowledged before the new beginning can be permitted. Gloriana's face in the linen is not revenge, it is an invoice. But what we've got is the linen symbolizes that domestic arrangement, in a sense. Almost, it's about... So the ethics are that he lived a lie for his own convenience with a woman he didn't really like, just so he could enjoy her money and property. And so it's ethical, isn't it? And of course, we've got to remember, I went to see, just before I went down to Wales, I was in Newcastle, saw the Royal Shakespeare Company's version of Hamlet. And of course, it's all about ethics, isn't it? The ghosts are all about ethics. And one of the oldest roles of a ghost in a story is to right wrongs, to point out where there have been transgressions in how things should be and where people have actually been naughty. I can't think of a posh word for that at the moment. So, in every case of this, so let's go back to the pomegranate seed briefly. It's more opaque, but the structure implies the same dynamic. His silence with Loring is not discretion, it is a continuation of inauthenticity that began in the first marriage and has transferred itself into the second. I would kind of revise that slightly now and say the inauthenticity now is with the second wife. You know, I suppose what we're saying about these is you have to, if you're in a relationship with somebody, You can't use them. It's not ethical to use them. And so old Tom Enderby uses Gloriana. In the second issue, the second one, the pomegranate seed, he's luring his second wife for emotional benefit, but he isn't honest with her. He's not true to her. Yeah. I mean, if we look at Rebecca, Maxim de Winter, his inauthenticity having reached a point of actual violence, that was a loveless marriage. It was so inauthentic. The world thought it was going on fine, and he in some sense benefited from that. He wanted to project this image of the county couple, very successful, but she wasn't very nice. But do you see what I'm saying? Inauthentic, and eventually he kills her and he gets away with it. There's ethics running right through this. But the other woman suffers, right? Okay. So the story asks what we owe to the dead and what it costs to carry an unexamined life forward into a future that demands honesty. I think that is the central message here. The mask that forms in Tom Enderby's handkerchief, in Lucy's embroidery, in the tablecloth at luncheon is made of the same cloth as Gloriana's shroud and her trousseau, and the household stock she managed without acknowledgement through servants for the duration of a marriage that was never what it pretended to be. Tom Enderby's tragedy is not that he is haunted, it is that he never learns what the haunting means. He never learns, does he? At the end of it, he's no further forward. He's like, oh, I can't get married because Gloriana. He's the victim still of his own inauthenticity. He doesn't seem to have any knowledge of why he should be why he should be punished. What am I saying? Why he should be punished, okay? He does never acknowledge that. There's no honest reckoning with himself. He doesn't carry any guilt for what he did to Lucy, for what he did to Gloriana, for his slimy, backboneless corruption. I mean, he's presented as a decent sort of chap, but he's not at all. Okay. These husbands, in all these stories, are not simply men who contracted inauthentic first marriages and are now paying the price, or inauthentic second. They are men who at some level preferred the inauthenticity. They don't. Does Maxim de Winter, he gets away with a crime. And in the other two cases, the snow and the pomegranate seed, the husbands disappear with the wife. So they never make that moral reckoning. And you could argue that they suffer, but the second wife suffers, or Lucy, her hopes are dashed. She's been the subject of a broken engagement, which will cast shade, as they say, on her. Anyway, there we go. So it's amazing what you can get out of a short piece, an apparently simple ghost story. And this is why I think they reward study, because they're not just simple stories in many cases. They have actually something to say about the human condition. And in this case, I think it's an ethical story. So I think that's what it's about, more than Freud or anything like that. Anyway, okay, hope you enjoyed it. Take care, bye.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret? Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
This week, I'm going to be reading The Thing Invisible, a Carnacki the Ghost Hunter story written by W.H. Hodgson. Carnacki had just returned to Cheyne Walk, Chelsea. I was aware of this interesting fact by reason of the curt and quaintly worded postcard which I was rereading, and by which I was requested to present myself at his house not later than 7 o'clock on that evening. Mr. Carnacki had, as I and the others of his strictly limited circle of friends knew, been away in Kent for the past 3 weeks, but beyond that we had no knowledge. Carnacki was genially secretive and curt, and spoke only when he was ready to speak. When this stage arrived, I and his three other friends, Jessup, Arkwright, and Taylor, would receive a card or a wire asking us to call. None of us ever willingly missed, for after a thoroughly sensible little dinner, Karnacki would snuggle down into his big armchair, light his pipe, and wait whilst we arranged ourselves comfortably in our accustomed seats and nooks. Then he would begin to talk. Upon this particular night, I was the first to arrive, and found Karnacki sitting, quietly smoking over a paper. He stood up, shook me firmly by the hand, pointed to a chair, and sat down again, never having uttered a word. For my part, I said nothing either. I knew the man too well to bother him with questions or the weather, and so took a seat and a cigarette. Presently, the three others turned up, and after that we spent a comfortable and busy hour at dinner. Dinner over, Karnacki snugged himself down into his great chair, as I have said was his habit, filled his pipe, and puffed for a while, his gaze directed thoughtfully at the fire. The rest of us, if I may so express it, made ourselves cosy, each after his own particular manner. A minute or so later, Karnacki began to speak, ignoring any preliminary remarks and going straight to the subject of the story we knew he had to tell. "I've just come back from St. Alfred Jarnock's place at Burton Tree in South Kent," he began, without removing his gaze from the fire. "Most extraordinary things have been happening down there lately, and Mr. George Jarnock, the eldest son, wired to ask me to run over and see whether I could help to clear matters up a bit. I went. When I got there, I found that they have an old chapel attached to the castle, which has had quite a distinguished reputation for being what is popularly termed haunted. They've been rather proud of this, as I managed to discover, until quite lately, when something very disagreeable occurred, which served to remind them that family ghosts are not always content, as I might say, to remain purely ornamental. It sounds almost laughable, I know, to hear of a long-respected supernatural phenomenon growing unexpectedly dangerous, and in this case the tale of the haunting was considered as little more than an old myth, except after nightfall, when it became more plausible seeming. But, however this may be, there is no doubt at all but that what I might term the haunting essence which lived in the place had become suddenly dangerous, deadly dangerous too, the old butler being nearly stabbed to death one night in the chapel with a peculiar old dagger. It is, in fact, this dagger which is popularly supposed to haunt the chapel. At least, there's always been a story handed down in the family that this dagger would attack any enemy who should dare to venture into the chapel after nightfall. But of course, this had been taken with just about the same amount of seriousness that people take most ghost tales, and that is not usually of a worryingly real nature. I mean that most people never quite know how much or how little they believe of matters abhuman or abnormal, and generally they never have an opportunity to learn, and indeed, as you are all well aware, I am as big a sceptic concerning the truth of ghost tales as any man you're likely to meet. Only I am what I might term an unprejudiced sceptic. I am not given to either believing or disbelieving things on principle, as I have found many idiots prone to be, and what is more, some of them not ashamed to boast of the insane fact. In fact, I view all reported hauntings as unproven until I have examined into them, and I am bound to admit that 99 cases in 100 turn out to be sheer bosh and fancy. But the 100th, well, if it were not for the 100th, I should have few stories to tell you, eh? Of course, after the attack on the butler, it became evident that there was at least something in the old story concerning the dagger, and I found everyone in a half-belief that the queer old weapon did really strike the butler, either by the aid of some inherent force, which I found them peculiarly unable to explain, or else in the hand of some invisible thing or monster of the outer world. From considerable experience, I knew it was much more likely that the butler had been knifed by some vicious and quite material human. Naturally, the first thing to do was to test this probability of human agency, and I set to work to make a pretty drastic examination of the people who knew most about the tragedy. The result of this examination both pleased and surprised me, for it left me with very good reasons for belief that I had come upon one of those extraordinary rare true manifestations of the extrusion of a force from the outside. In more popular phraseology, a genuine case of haunting. These are the facts. On the previous Sunday evening but one, Sir Alfred Jarnock's household had attended family service as usual in the chapel. You see, the rector goes over to officiate twice each Sunday after concluding his duties at the public church about 3 miles away. At the end of the service in the chapel, Sir Alfred Jarnock, his son Mr. George Jarnock, and the rector had stood for a couple of minutes talking, whilst old Bellet the butler went round putting out the candles. Suddenly, the rector remembered that he had left his small prayer book on the communion table in the morning. He turned and asked the butler to get it for him before he blew out the chancel candles. Now, I have particularly called your attention to this because it is important in that it provides witnesses in a most fortunate manner at an extraordinary moment. You see, the rector's turn to speak to Bellet had naturally caused both Sir Alfred Jarnock and his son to glance in the direction of the butler, and it was at this identical instant, and whilst all three were looking at him, that the old butler was stabbed, there, full in the candlelight, before their eyes. I took the opportunity to call early upon the rector, after I had questioned Mr. George Jarnock, who replied to my queries in place of Sir Alfred Jarnock, for the older man was in a nervous and shaken condition as a result of the happening, and his son wished him to avoid dwelling upon the scene as much as possible. The rector's version was clear and vivid, and he had evidently received the astonishment of his life. He pictured to me the whole affair. Bellet up at the chancel gate going for the prayer book and absolutely alone, and then the blow out of the void. He described it, and the force prodigious, the old man being driven headlong into the body of the chapel, like the kick of a great horse, the rector said, his benevolent old eyes bright and intense with the effort he had actually witnessed, in defiance of all that he had hitherto believed. When I left him, he went back to the writing which he had put aside when I appeared. I feel sure that he was developing the first unorthodox sermon that he had ever evolved. He was a dear old chap, and I should certainly like to have heard it. The last man I visited was the butler. He was, of course, in a frightfully weak and shaken condition, but he could tell me nothing that didn't point to there being a power abroad in the chapel. He told the same tale in every minute particle that I had learned from the others. He had been just going up to put out the altar candles and fetch the rector's book when something struck him, an enormous blow, high up on the left breast, and he was driven headlong into the aisle. Examination had shown that he had been stabbed by the dagger, of which I will tell you more in a moment, that hung always above the altar. The weapon had entered, fortunately, some inches above the heart, just under the collarbone, which had been broken by the stupendous force of the blow, the dagger itself being driven clean through the body and out through the scapula behind. The poor old fellow could not talk much, and I soon left him. But what he had told me was sufficient to make it unmistakable that no living person had been within yards of him when he was attacked, and, as I knew, this fact was verified by 3 capable and responsible witnesses, independent of Bellet himself. The thing now was to search the chapel, which is small and extremely old. It is very massively built, and entered through only one door, which leads out of the castle itself, and the key of which is kept by Sir Alfred Jarnock, the butler having no duplicate. The shape of the chapel is oblong, and the altar is railed off after the usual fashion. There are 2 tombs in the body of the place, but none in the chancel, which is bare, except for the tall candlesticks in the chancel rail, beyond which is the undraped altar of solid marble, upon which stand 4 small candlesticks, 2 at each end. Above the altar hangs the waeful dagger, as I had learned it was named. I fancy the term has been taken from an old vellum, which describes the dagger and its supposed abnormal properties. I took the dagger down and examined it minutely and with method. The blade is 10 inches long, 2 inches broad at the base, and tapering to a rounded but sharp point rather peculiar. It is double-edged. The metal sheath is curious for having a cross-piece, which, taken with the fact that the sheath itself is continued 3 parts up the hilt of the dagger in a most inconvenient fashion, gives the appearance of a cross. That this is not unintentional is shown by an engraving of the Christ crucified upon one side, whilst upon the other in Latin is the inscription, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." A quaint and rather terrible conjunction of ideas. Upon the blade of the dagger is graven in Old English capitals, "I watch, I strike." On the butt of the hilt there is carved deeply a pentacle. This is a pretty accurate description of the peculiar old weapon that has had the curious and uncomfortable reputation of being able, either of its own accord or in the hand of something invisible, to strike murderously at any enemy of the Jarnock family who may chance to enter the chapel after nightfall. I may tell you here and now that before I left, I had very good reason to put certain doubts behind me, for I tested the deadliness of the thing myself. As you know, however, at this point of the investigation, I was still at that stage where I considered the existence of a supernatural force unproven. In the meanwhile, I treated the chapel drastically, sounding and scrutinizing the walls and floor, dealing with them almost foot by foot, and particularly examining the 2 tombs. At the end of this search, I had in a ladder and made a close survey of the groined roof. I passed 3 days in this fashion, and by the evening of the 3rd day I had proved to my entire satisfaction that there is no place in the whole of that chapel where any living being could have hidden, and also that the only way of ingress and egress to and from the chapel is through the doorway which leads into the castle, the door of which was always kept locked, the key kept by Sir Alfred Jarnock himself, as I've told you. I mean, of course, that this doorway is the only entrance practicable to material people. Yes, as you will see, even had I discovered some other opening, secret or otherwise, it would not have helped at all to explain the mystery of the incredible attack in a normal fashion, for the butler, as you know, was struck in full sight of the rector, Sir Jarnock, and his son, and old Bellet himself knew that no living person had touched him. Out of the void, the rector had described the inhumanly brutal attack. Out of the void. A strange feeling it gives one. Eh? And this is the thing that I had been called in to bottom. After considerable thought, I decided on a plan of action. I proposed to Sir Alfred Jarnock that I should spend a night in the chapel and keep a constant watch upon the dagger. But to do this, the old knight, a little wizened and nervous man, would not listen for a moment. He, at least, I felt assured, had no doubt of the reality of some dangerous supernatural force aroam at night in the chapel. He informed me that it had been his habit every evening to lock the chapel door so that no one might foolishly or heedlessly run the risk of any peril that it might hold at night, and that he could not allow me to attempt such a thing after what had happened to the butler. I could see that Sir Alfred Jarnock was very much in earnest, and would evidently have held himself to blame had he allowed me to make the experiment, and any harm had come to me. So I said nothing in argument, and presently, pleading the fatigue of his years and health, he said good night and left me, having given me the impression of being a polite but rather superstitious old gentleman. That night, however, whilst I was undressing, I saw how I might achieve the thing I wished, and be able to enter the chapel after dark without making Sir Alfred Jarnock nervous. On the morrow, when I borrowed the key,
I would take an impression and have a duplicate made. Then, with my private key, I could do just what I liked. In the morning, I carried out my idea. I borrowed the key as I wanted to take a photograph of the chancel by daylight. When I had done this, I locked up the chapel and handed the key to Sir Alfred Jarnock, having first taken impression in soap. I had brought out the exposed plate in its slide with me, but the camera I had left exactly as it was, as I wanted to take a second photograph of the chancel that night from the same position. I took the dark slide into Burtontree, also the cake of soap with the impress. The soap I left with the local ironmonger, who was something of a locksmith, and promised to let me have my duplicate finished if I would call in 2 hours. This I did, having in the meanwhile found out a photographer where I developed the plate and left it to dry, telling him I would call next day. At the end of the 2 hours I went for my key and found it ready, much to my satisfaction. Then I returned to the castle. After dinner that evening, I played billiards with young Jarnock for a couple of hours. Then I had a cup of coffee and went off to my room, telling him I was feeling awfully tired. He nodded and told me he felt the same way. I was glad, for I wanted the house to settle as soon as possible. I locked the door of my room. Then, from under the bed, where I had hidden them earlier in the evening, I drew out several pieces of plate armour which I had removed from the armoury. There was also a shirt of chain mail with a sort of quilted hood of mail to go over the head. I buckled on the plate armour and found it extraordinarily uncomfortable. And over all I drew on the chain mail. I know nothing about armour, but from what I have learned since, I must have put on parts of 2 suits. Anyway, I felt beastly, clamped and clumsy, and unable to move my arms and legs naturally. But I knew that the thing I was thinking of doing called for some sort of protection for my body. Over the armour, I pulled on my dressing gown and shoved my revolver into one of the side pockets, and my repeating flashlight into the other. My dark lantern I carried in my hand. As soon as I was ready, I went out into the passage and listened. I had been some considerable time making my preparations, and I found that now the big hall and staircase were in darkness and all the house seemed quiet. I stepped back and closed and locked my door. Then, very slowly and silently, I went downstairs to the hall and turned into the passage that led to the chapel. I reached the door and tried my key. It fitted perfectly, and a moment later I was in the chapel with the door locked behind me, and all about me the utter dree silence of the place, with just the faint showings of the outlines of the stained leaded windows, making the darkness and lonesomeness almost the more apparent. Now, it would be silly to say I did not feel queer. I felt very queer indeed. You just try, any of you, to imagine yourself standing there in the dark silence and remembering not only the legend that was attached to the place, but what had really happened to the old butler only a little while ago. I can tell you, as I stood there, I could believe that something invisible was coming toward me in the air of the chapel. Yet I had got to go through with the business, and I just took hold of my little bit of courage and set to work. First of all, I switched on my light. Then I began a careful tour of the place, examining every corner and nook. I found nothing unusual. At the chancel gate, I held up my lamp and flashed the light at the dagger. It hung there right enough above the altar, but I remember thinking of the word demure as I looked at it. However, I pushed the thought away, for what I was doing needed no addition of uncomfortable thoughts. I completed the tour of the place with a constantly growing awareness of its utter chill and unkind desolation. An atmosphere of cold dismalness seemed to be everywhere, and the quiet was abominable. At the conclusion of my search, I walked across to where I had left my camera focused upon the chancel. From the satchel that I had put beneath the tripod, I took out a dark slide and inserted it into the camera, drawing the shutter. After that, I uncapped the lens, pulled out my flashlight apparatus, and pressed the trigger. There was an intense, brilliant flash that made the whole of the interior of the chapel jump into sight and disappear just as quickly. Then, in the light from my lantern, I inserted the shutter into the slide and reversed the slide so as to have a fresh plate ready to expose at any time. After I had done this, I shut off my lantern and sat down in one of the pews near to my camera. I cannot say what I expected to happen, but I had an extraordinary feeling, almost a conviction, that something peculiar or horrible would soon occur. It was, as if I knew. An hour passed of absolute silence. The time I knew by the far-off faint chime of a clock that had been erected over the stables. It was beastly cold, for the whole place was without any kind of heating pipes or furnace, as I had noticed during my search, so that the temperature was sufficiently uncomfortable to suit my frame of mind. I felt like a human periwinkle encased in boilerplate and frozen with cold and funk. And, you know, somehow the dark about me seemed to press coldly against my face. I cannot say whether any of you have ever had the feeling, but if you have, you will know just how disgustingly unnerving it is. And then, all at once, I had a horrible sense that something was moving in the place. It was not that I could hear anything, but I had a kind of intuitive knowledge that something had stirred in the darkness. Can you imagine how I felt? Suddenly my courage went. I put up my mailed arms over my face. I wanted to protect it. I got a sudden sickening feeling that something was hovering over me in the dark. Talk about fright. I could have shouted if I had not been afraid of the noise, and then, abruptly, I heard something. Away up the aisle, there sounded a dull clang of metal, as it might be the tread of a mailed heel upon the stone of the aisle. I sat immovable. I was fighting with all my strength to get back my courage. I couldn't take my arms down from over my face, but I knew that I was getting hold of the gritty part of me again, and suddenly I made a mighty effort and lowered my arms. I held my face up in the darkness, and I tell you, I respect myself for the act, because I thought truly at that moment I was going to die. But I think just then, by the slow revulsion of feeling which had assisted my effort, I was less sick in that instant at the thought of having to die than at the knowledge of the utter weak cowardice that had so unexpectedly shaken me all to bits for a time. Do I make myself clear? You understand, I feel sure, that the sense of respect which I spoke of is not really unhealthy egotism, because, you see, I'm not blind to the state of mind which helped me. I mean that if I had uncovered my face by a sheer effort of will, unhelped by any revulsion of feeling, I should have done a thing much more worthy of mention. But even as it was, there were elements in the act worthy of respect. You follow me, don't you? And nothing touched me after all. So that in a little while I had got a bit back to my normal and felt steady enough to go through with the business without any more funking. I dare say a couple of minutes passed, and then, away up near the chancel, there came again that clang, as though an armoured foot stepped cautiously. By Jove, but it made me stiffen. And suddenly the thought came that the sound I heard might be the rattle of the dagger above the altar. It was not a particularly sensible notion, for the sound was far too heavy and resonant for such a cause. Yet, as can be easily understood, my reason was bound to submit somewhat to my fancy at such a time. I remember now that the idea of that insensate thing becoming animate and attacking me did not occur to me with any sense of possibility or reality. I thought rather, in a vague way, of some invisible monster of outer space fumbling at the dagger. I remember the old rector's description of the attack on the butler, of the void, and he had described the stupendous force of the blow as being like the kick of a great horse. You can see how uncomfortably my thoughts were running. I felt round swiftly and cautiously for my lantern. I found it close to me on the pew seat. and with a sudden jerky movement I switched on the light. I flashed it up the aisle, to and fro across the chancel, but I could see nothing to frighten me. I turned quickly and set the jet of light darting across and across the rear end of the chapel, then on each side of me, before and behind, up at the roof and down at the marble floor, but nowhere was there any visible thing to put me in fear, not a thing that need have set my flesh thrilling, just the quiet chapel, cold and eternally silent. You know the feeling. I had been standing whilst I sent the light about the chapel, but now I pulled out my revolver, and then, with a tremendous effort of will, switched off the light and sat down again in the darkness to continue my constant watch. It seemed to me that quite half an hour, or even more, must have passed after this, during which no sound had broken the intense stillness. I had grown less nervously tense, for the flashing of the light round the place had made me feel less out of bounds of the normal. It had given me something of that unreasoned sense of safety that a nervous child obtains at night by covering its head up with the bedcloth. This just about illustrates the completely human illogicalness of the workings of my feelings, for, as you know, whatever creature, thing, or being it was that had made that extraordinary and horrible attack on the old butler, it had certainly not been visible. And so you must picture me sitting there in the dark, clumsy with armour, and with my revolver in one hand and nursing my lantern ready with the other. And then it was, after this little time of partial relief from intense nervousness, that there came a fresh strain on me. For somewhere in the utter quiet of the chapel, I thought I heard something. I listened, tense and rigid, my heart booming just a little in my ears for a moment. Then I thought I heard it again. I felt sure that something had moved at the top of the aisle. I strained in the darkness to hark, and my eyes showed me blackness within blackness wherever I glanced, so that I took no heed of what they told me, for even if I looked at the dim loom of the stained window at the top of the chancel, my sight gave me the shapes of vague shadows passing noiseless and ghostly across constantly. There was a time of almost peculiar silence, horrible to me, as I felt just then, and suddenly I seemed to hear a sound again, nearer to me and repeated, infinitely stealthy. It was as if a vast, soft tread were coming slowly down the aisle. Can you imagine how I felt? I do not think you can. I did not move, any more than the stone effigies on the two tombs, but sat there, stiffened. I fancied now that I heard the tread all about the chapel, and then, you know, I was just as sure in a moment that I could not hear it, that I had never heard it. Some particularly long minutes passed about this time, but I think my nerves must have quieted a bit, for I remember being sufficiently aware of my feelings to realize that the muscles of my shoulders ached, with the way that they must have been contracted as I sat there, hunching myself rigid. Mind you, I was still in a disgusting funk, but what I might call the imminent sense of danger seemed to have eased from around me at any rate. I felt in some curious fashion that there was a respite, a temporary cessation of malignity from about me. It is impossible to word my feelings more clearly to you, for I cannot see them more clearly than this myself. Yet you must not picture me as sitting there free from strain, for the nerve tension was so great that my heart action was a little out of normal control, the blood beat making a dull booming at times in my ears, with the result that I had the sensation that I could not hear acutely. This is a simply beastly feeling, especially under such circumstances. I was sitting like this, listening, as I might say, with body and soul, when suddenly I got that hideous conviction again that something was moving in the air of the place. The feeling seemed to stiffen me as I sat, and my head appeared to tighten, as if all the scalp had grown tense. This was so real that I suffered an actual pain, most peculiar and at the same time intense. The whole head pained. I had a fierce desire to cover my face again with my mailed arms, but I fought it off. If I had given way then to that, I should simply have bunked straight out of the place. I sat and sweated coldly, that's the bald truth, with the creep busy at my spine. And then, abruptly once more, I thought I heard the sound of that huge, soft tread on the aisle, and this time closer to me. There was an awful little silence, during which I had the feeling that something enormous was bending over toward me from the aisle, and then, through the booming of the blood in my ears, there came a slight sound from the place where my camera stood, a disagreeable sort of slithering sound, and then a sharp tap. I had the lantern ready in my left hand, and now I snapped it on desperately and shone it straight above me, for I had the conviction that there was something there, but I saw nothing. Immediately I flashed the light at the camera and along the aisle, but again there was nothing visible. I wheeled round, shooting the beam of light in a great circle about the place. To and fro I shone it, jerking it here and there, but it showed me nothing. I had stood up the instant that I had seen that there was nothing in sight over me, and now I determined to visit the chancel and see whether the dagger had been touched. I stepped out of the pew into the aisle, and here I came to an abrupt pause, for an almost invincible, sick repugnance was fighting me back from the upper part of the chapel. A constant queer prickling went up and down my spine, and the dull ache took me in the small of the back as I fought with myself to conquer this sudden new feeling of terror and horror. I tell you that no one who has not been through these kinds of experiences has any idea of the sheer actual physical pain attendant upon and resulting from the intense nerve strain that ghostly fright sets up in the human system. I stood there feeling positively ill, but I got myself in hand, as it were, in about half a minute, and then I went walking, I expect, as jerky as a mechanical tin man, and switching the light from side to side before and behind and over my head continually. And the hand that held my revolver sweated so much that the thing fairly slipped in my fist. Doesn't sound very heroic, does it? I passed through the short chancel and reached the step that led up to the small gate in the chancel rail. I threw the beam from my lantern upon the dagger. Yes, I thought, it's all right. Abruptly it seemed to me that there was something wanting, and I leaned forward over the chancel gate to peer, holding the light high. My suspicion was hideously correct. The dagger had gone. Only the cross-shaped sheath hung there above the altar. In a sudden, frightened flash of imagination, I pictured the thing adrift in the chapel, moving here and there as though of its own volition, for whatever force wielded it was certainly beyond visibility. I turned my head stiffly over to the left, glancing frightenedly behind me and flashing the light to help my eyes. In the same instant, I was struck a tremendous blow on the left wrist and hurled backward from the chancel rail into the aisle, my armour clanging loudly in the horrible silence. I landed on my back and slithered along the polished marble. My shoulders struck the corner of a pew front and brought me up half-stunned. I scrambled to my feet, horribly sick and shaken, but the fear that was on me, making little of that at the moment, I was minus both revolver and lantern, and utterly bewildered as just to where I was standing. I bowed my head and made a scrambling run in the complete darkness and dashed into a pew. I jumped back, staggering, got my bearings a little, and raced down the centre of the aisle, putting my mailed arms over my face. I plunged into my camera, hurling it among the pews. I crashed into the font and reeled back. Then I was at the exit. I fumbled madly in my dressing-gown pocket for the key. I found it and scraped at the door feverishly for the keyhole. I found the keyhole, turned the key, burst the door open, and was into the passage. I slammed the door and leant hard against it, gasping, whilst I felt crazily again for the keyhole, this time to lock the door upon what was in the chapel. I succeeded, and began to feel my way stupidly along the wall of the corridor. Presently I had come to the big hall, and so, in a little, to my room. In my room I sat for a while, until I had steadied down something to the normal. After a time I commenced to strip off the armour. I saw then that both the chainmail and the plate armour had been pierced over the breast, and suddenly it came home to me that the thing had struck for my heart. Stripping rapidly, I found that the skin of the breast over the heart had just been cut sufficiently to allow a little blood to stain my shirt, nothing more. Only the whole breast was badly bruised and intensely painful. You can imagine what would have happened if I had not worn the armour. In any case, it is a marvel that I wasn't knocked senseless. I did not go to bed at all that night, but sat upon the edge, thinking and waiting for the dawn, for I had to remove my litter before Sir Alfred Jarnock should enter, if I were to hide from him the fact that I had managed a duplicate key. So soon as the pale light of the morning had strengthened sufficiently to show me the various details of my room, I made my way quietly down to the chapel, very silently and with tense nerves. I opened the door. The chill light of dawn made distinct the whole place, everything seeming instinct with a ghostly, unearthly quiet. Can you get the feeling? I waited several minutes at the door, allowing the morning to grow, and likewise my courage, I suppose. Presently, the rising sun threw an odd beam right in through the big east window, making coloured sunshine all the length of the chapel, and then, with a tremendous effort, I forced myself to enter. I went up the aisle to where I had overthrown my camera in the darkness. The legs of the tripod were sticking up from the interior of a pew, and I expected to find the machine smashed to pieces, yet, beyond that the ground glass was broken, there was no real damage done. I replaced the camera in the position from which I had taken the previous photography, but the slide containing the plate I had exposed by flashlight I removed and put into one of my side pockets, regretting that I had not taken a second flash picture at the instant when I heard those strange sounds up in the chancel. Having tidied my photographic apparatus, I went to the chancel to recover my lantern and revolver, which had both, as you know, been knocked from my hands when I was stabbed. I found the lantern lying hopelessly bent, with smashed lens just under the pulpit. My revolver I must have held until my shoulder struck the pew, for it was lying there in the aisle, just about where I believed I cannoned into the pew corner. It was quite undamaged. Having secured these two articles, I walked up the chancel rail to see whether the dagger had returned, or been returned, to its sheath above the altar. Before, however, I reached the chancel rail, I had a slight shock, for there, on the floor of the chancel, about a yard away from where I had been struck, lay the dagger, quiet and demure upon the polished marble pavement. I wonder whether you will, any of you, understand the nervousness that took me at the sight of the thing. With a sudden, unreasoned action, I jumped forward and put my foot on it to hold it there. Can you understand? Do you? And, I could not stoop down and pick it up with my hands for quite a minute, I should think. Afterward, when I had done so, however, and handled it a little, this feeling passed away, and my reason, and also, I expect, the daylight, made me feel that I had been a little bit of an ass. Quite natural, though, I assure you. Yet it was a new kind of fear to me. I'm taking no notice of the cheap joke about the ass. I'm talking about the curiousness of learning in that moment a new shade or quality of fear that had hitherto been outside of my knowledge or imagination. Does it interest you? I examined the dagger minutely, turning it over and over in my hands, and never, as I suddenly discovered, holding it loosely. It was as if I was subconsciously surprised that it lay quiet in my hands. Yet even this feeling passed largely after a short while. The curious weapon showed no signs of the blow, except that the dull colour of the blade was slightly brighter on the rounded point that had cut through the armour. Presently, when I had made an end of staring at the dagger, I went up to the chancel step and in through the little gate. Then, kneeling upon the altar, I replaced the dagger in its sheath and came outside of the rail again, closing the gate after me and feeling aware uncomfortable because the horrible old weapon was again back in its accustomed place. I suppose, without analysing my feelings very deeply, I had an unreasoned and only half-conscious belief that there was a greater probability of danger when the dagger hung in its 5th-century resting place than when it was out of it. Yet, somehow, I don't think this is a very good explanation, when I remember the demure look the thing seemed to have when I saw it lying on the floor of the chancel. Only I know this, that when I had replaced the dagger, I had quite a touch of nerves, and I stopped only to pick up my lantern from where I had placed it whilst I examined the weapon, after which I went down the quiet aisle at a pretty quick walk, and so got out of the place. The nerve tension had been considerable, I realized, when I had locked the door behind me. I felt no inclination now to think of old Sir Alfred as a hypochondriac because he had taken such hyper-seeming precautions regarding the chapel. I had a sudden wonder as to whether he might not have some knowledge of a long prior tragedy in which the dagger had been concerned. I returned to my room, washed, shaved, and dressed, after which I read a while. Then I went downstairs and got the acting butler to give me some sandwiches and a cup of coffee. Half an hour later, I was heading for Burtontree as hard as I could walk, for a certain idea had come to me, which I was anxious to test. I reached the town a little before 8:30 and found the local photographer with his shutters still up. I did not wait, but knocked until he appeared with his coat off, evidently in the act of dealing with his breakfast. In a few words, I made it clear that I wanted the use of his darkroom immediately, and this he at once placed at my disposal. I had brought with me the slide which contained the plate that I had used with the flashlight, and as soon as I was ready, I set to work to develop. Yet it was not the plate which I had exposed that I first put into the solution, but the second plate, which had been ready in the camera during all the time of my waiting in the darkness. You see, the lens had been uncapped all that while, so the whole chancel had been, as it were, under observation. You all know something of my experiments in lightless photography, that is, appreciating light. It was X-ray work that started me in that direction. Yet, you must understand, though I was attempting to develop this unexposed plate, I had no definite idea of results, nothing more than a vague hope that it might show me something. Yet, because of the possibilities, it was with the most intense and absorbing interest that I watched the plate under the actions of the developer. Presently, I saw a faint smudge of black appear in the upper part, and after that, others, indistinct and wavering of outline. I held the negative up to the light. The marks were rather small, and were almost entirely confined to one end of the plate, but, as I have said, lacked definiteness. Yet, such as they were sufficient to make me very excited, and I shoved the thing quickly back into the solution. For some minutes I further watched it, lifting it out once or twice to make a more exact scrutiny, but I could not imagine what the markings might represent until, suddenly, it occurred to me that in one or two places they certainly had shapes suggestive of a cross-hilted dagger, yet the shapes were sufficiently indefinite to make me careful not to let myself be over-impressed by the uncomfortable resemblance, though, I must confess, the very thought was sufficient to set some odd thrills adrift in me. I carried development a little further, then put the negative into the hypo and commenced work upon the other plate. This came up nicely, and very soon I had a really decent negative that appeared similar in every respect, except for the difference of lighting, to the negative I had taken during the previous day. I fixed the plate. Then, having washed both it and the unexposed one for a few minutes under the tap, I put them into methylated spirits for 15 minutes, after which I carried them into the photographer's kitchen and dried them in the oven. Whilst the two plates were drying, the photographer and I made an enlargement from the negative I had taken by daylight. Then we did the same with the two that I had just developed, washing them as quickly as possible, for I was not troubling about the permanency of the prints, and drying them with spirits. When this was done, I took them to the window and made a thorough examination, commencing with the one that appeared to show shadowy daggers in several places. Yet, though it was now enlarged, I was still unable to feel convinced the marks truly represented anything abnormal, and because of this, I put it to one side, determined not to let my imagination play too large a part in constructing weapons out of the indefinite outlines. I took up the other two enlargements, both of the chancel, as you remember, and commenced to compare them. For some minutes I examined them without being able to distinguish any difference in the scene they portrayed, and then, abruptly, I saw something in which they varied. In the second enlargement, the one made from the flashlight negative, the dagger was not in its sheath, yet I had felt sure it was there but a few minutes before I took the photograph. After this discovery, I began to compare the two enlargements in a very different manner from my previous scrutiny. I borrowed a pair of calipers from the photographer, and with these I carried out a most methodical and exact comparison of the details shown in the two photographs. Suddenly I came upon something that set me all tingling with excitement. I threw the calipers down, paid the photographer, and walked out through the shop into the street. The three enlargements I took with me, making them into a roll as I went. At the corner of the street I had the luck to get a cab and was soon back at the castle. I hurried up to my room and put the photographs away. Then I went down to see whether I could find Sir Alfred Jarnock, but Mr. George Jarnock, who met me, told me that his father was too unwell to rise and would prefer that no one entered the chapel unless he were about. Young Jarnock made a half-apologetic excuse for his father, remarking that Sir Alfred Jarnock was perhaps inclined to be a little over-careful, but that considering what had happened, we must agree that the need for his carefulness had been justified. He added also that even before the horrible attack on the butler, his father had been just as particular, always keeping the key and never allowing the drawer to be unlocked. He added also that even before the horrible attack on the butler, his father had been just as particular, always keeping the key and never allowing the door to be unlocked, except when the place was in use for divine service and for an hour each forenoon, when the cleaners were in. To all this I nodded understandingly, but when presently the young man left me, I took my duplicate key and made for the door of the chapel. I went in and locked it behind me, after which I carried out some intensely interesting and rather weird experiments. These proved successful to such an extent that I came out of the place in a perfect fever of excitement. I inquired for Mr. George Jarnock and was told that he was in the morning room. "Come along," I said when I had found him. "Please give me a lift. I have something exceedingly strange to show you." He was palpably much puzzled, but came quickly. As we strode along, he asked me a score of questions, to all of which I just shook my head, asking him to wait a little. I led the way to the armoury. Here I suggested that he should take one side of a dummy dressed in half-plate armour, whilst I took the other. He nodded, though obviously vastly bewildered, and together we carried the thing to the chapel door. When he saw me take out my key and open the way for us, he appeared even more astonished, but held himself in, evidently waiting for me to explain. We entered the chapel, and I locked the door behind us, after which we carted the armoured dummy up the aisle to the gate of the chancel rail, where we put it down upon its round wooden stand. "Stand back!" I shouted suddenly, as young Jarnock made a movement to open the gate. "My God, man, you mustn't do that!" Do what?" he asked, half startled and half irritated by my words and manner. "1 minute," I said. Just stand to the side a moment and watch." He stepped to the left, whilst I took the dummy in my arms and turned it to face the altar, so that it stood close to the gate. Then, standing well away on the right side, I pressed the back of the thing, so that it leant forward a little upon the gate, which flew open. In the same instant the dummy was struck a tremendous blow that hurled it into the aisle, the armour rattling and clanging upon the polished marble floor. "Good God!" shouted young Jarnock, and ran back from the chancel rail, his face very white. "Come and look at the thing," I said, and led the way to where the dummy lay, its armoured upper limbs all splayed adrift in queer contortions. I stooped over it and pointed. There, driven right through the thick steel breastplate, was the waeful dagger. "Good God!" said young Jarnock again. Good God! It's a dagger. The thing's been stabbed, same as Bellet." "Yes," I replied, and saw him glance swiftly towards the entrance of the chapel. But I will do him the justice to say that he never budged an inch. "Come and see how it was done," I said, and led the way back to the chancel rail. From the wall to the left of the altar I took down a long, curiously ornamented iron instrument, not unlike a short spear. The sharp end of this I inserted in a hole in the left-hand gatepost of the chancel gateway. I lifted hard, and a section of the post from the floor upward bent inward toward the altar, as though hinged at the bottom. Down it went, leaving the remaining part of the post standing. As I bent the movable portion lower, there came a quick click, and the section of the floor slid to one side, showing a long, shallow cavity sufficient to enclose the post. I put my weight to the lever and hove the post down into the niche. Immediately there was a sharp clang as some catch snicked in and held it against the powerful operating spring. I went over now to the dummy, and after a few minutes' work managed to wrench the dagger loose out of the armour. I brought the old weapon and placed its hilt in a hole near the top of the post, where it fitted loosely, the point upward. After that, I went again to the lever and gave another strong heave, and the post descended about a foot to the bottom of the cavity, catching there with another clang. I withdrew the lever, and the narrow strip of floor slid back, covering post and dagger, and looking no different from the surrounding surface. Then I shut the chancel gate, and we both stood well to the side. I took the spear-like lever and gave the gate a little push so that it opened. Instantly there was a loud thud, and something sang through the air, striking the bottom wall of the chapel. It was the dagger. I showed Jarnock then that the other half of the post had sprung back into place, making the whole post as thick as the one upon the right-hand side of the gate. "There," I said, turning to the young man and tapping the divided post, "there's the invisible thing that used the dagger. But who the deuce is the person who sets the trap?" I looked at him keenly as I spoke. My father's the only one who has a key," he said, "so it's practically impossible for anyone to get into metal." I looked at him again, but it was obvious that he had not yet reached out to any conclusion. "See here, Mr. Jarnock," I said, perhaps rather curter than I should have done, considering what I had to say. "Are you sure that Sir Alfred is quite balanced mentally?" He looked at me half frightenedly and flushing a little. I realized how badly I'd put it. I don't know," he replied, after a slight pause, and was then silent, except for one or two incoherent half-remarks. "Tell the truth," I said. "Haven't you suspected something now and again? You needn't be afraid to tell me." "Well," he answered slowly, "I'll admit I've thought father a little strange, perhaps, at times, but I've always tried to think I was mistaken. I've always hoped that no one else would see it. You see, I'm very fond of the old governor." I nodded. "Quite right, too," I said. "There's not the least need to make any kind of scandal about this. We must do something, though, but in a quiet way. No fuss, you know. I should go and have a chat with your father and tell him we've found out about this thing." I touched the divided post. Young Jarnock seemed very grateful for my advice, and after shaking my hand pretty hard, took my key and let himself out of the chapel. He came back in about an hour looking rather upset. He told me that my conclusions were perfectly correct. It was Sir Alfred Jarnock who had set the trap, both on the night that the butler was nearly killed and on the past night. Indeed, it seemed that the old gentleman had set it every night for many years. He had learned of its existence from an old manuscript book in the castle library. It had been planned and used in an earlier age as a protection for the gold vessels of the ritual, which were, it seemed, kept in a hidden recess at the back of the altar. This recess Sir Alfred Jarnock had utilised secretly to store his wife's jewellery. She had died some years back, and the young man told me that his father had never seemed quite the same since. I mentioned to young Jarnock how puzzled I was that the trap had been set before the service on the night that the butler was struck, for, if I understood him aright, his father had been in the habit of setting the trap late every evening and unsetting it each morning before anyone entered the chapel. He replied that his father, in a fit of temporary forgetfulness, natural enough in his neurotic condition, must have set it too early, and hence what had nearly so proved a tragedy. That's about all there is to tell. The old man is not, as far as I could learn, really insane in the popularly accepted sense of the word. He is extremely neurotic and has developed into a hypochondriac, the whole condition probably brought about by the shock and sorrow resultant on the death of his wife, leading to years of sad broodings and to overmuch of his own company and thoughts. Indeed, young Jarnock told me that his father would sometimes pray for hours together alone in the chapel. Carnacki made an end of speaking, and leant forward for a spill. "But you've never told us just how you discovered the secret of the divided post and all that," I said, speaking for the four of us. "Oh, that," replied Kanaki, puffing vigorously at his pipe. "I found, on comparing the photos, that the one taken in the daytime showed a thicker left-hand gatepost than the one taken at night by the flashlight. That put me on the track. I saw at once that there might be some mechanical dodge at the back of the whole queer business, nothing at all of an abnormal nature. I examined the post, and the rest was simple enough, you know. By the way," he continued, rising and going to the mantelpiece, "you may be interested to have a look at the so-called waeful dagger. Young Jarnock was kind enough to present it to me as a little memento of my adventure." He handed it round to us, and whilst we examined it, stood silent before the fire, puffing meditatively at his pipe. "Jarnock and I made the trap so that it won't work," he remarked after a few moments. "I've got the dagger, as you see, and the butler's getting about again, so that the whole business can be hushed up decently. All the same, I fancy the chapel will never lose its reputation as a dangerous place. Should be pretty safe now to keep valuables in." "There's two things you haven't explained yet," I said. "What do you think caused the two clangy sounds when you were in the chapel in the dark? And do you believe the soft tready sounds were real, or only a fancy with your being so worked up and tense?" "Don't know for certain about the clangs," replied Kanaki. "I've puzzled quite a bit about them. I can only think that the spring which worked the post must have given a little, slipped, you know, in the catch. If it did, under such tension, it would make a bit of a ringing noise. And a little sound goes a long way in the middle of the night when you're thinking of ghostesses. You can understand that, eh?" "Yes," I agreed. "And the other sounds?" "Well, the same thing. I mean, the extraordinary quietness may help to explain these a bit. They may have been some unusual enough sound that would never have been noticed under ordinary conditions, or they may only have been fancy. It's just impossible to say. They were disgustingly real to me. As for the slithery noise, I'm pretty sure that one of the tripod legs of my camera must have slipped a few inches. If it did so, it might easily have jolted the lens cap off the baseboard, which would account for that little queer tap which I heard directly after." "How do you account for the dagger being in its place above the altar when you first examined it that night?" I asked. "How could it be there, when at the very moment it was set in the trap?" "That was my mistake," replied Kanaki. "The dagger could not possibly have been in its sheath at the time, though I thought it was. You see, the curious cross-hilted sheath gave the appearance of the complete weapon, as you can understand. The hilt of the dagger protrudes very little above the continued portion of the sheath, a most inconvenient arrangement for drawing quickly." He nodded sagely at the lot of us and yawned, then glanced at the clock. "Out you go," he said in a friendly fashion, using the recognized formula. "I want to sleep." We rose, shook him by the hand, and went out presently into the night and the quiet of the embankment, and so to our homes.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come?
This is the bit where I implore you to join my Patreon to support me do more stories, innit? So I can just sit and do more stories. So yeah, go to Patreon, www.patreon.com/Barcud, BARCUD. That's it. And you can sign up, I think it's $7 a month now. Cost of living crisis, mate. And there you are. So if you're happy to support me like that would be absolutely splendid, and I could keep doing these kind of things. I hope you enjoyed the story. I did, yeah. I don't know always, but I did on that one. So why do you read a story if you don't like it? Well, a couple of reasons. People ask me to read them, so I read them, and they like them, and I suppose that brings pleasure to people. And sometimes I pick a story and I think it's all right, and I get 2/3 of the way through, and I've already got the sunken costs of having read 2/3 of the story, say 40 minutes of the story, which actually takes me an hour and a half. It takes me like double the time to do it. and then I just continue it, and then I pretend I like it because I don't want to look foolish. The Triumph of Death by H. Russell Wakefield. This story is for Terry Illikainen. Amelia, said Miss Prunella Pendleham, I've received a most impertinent letter this morning. Yes, Miss Pendleham? It's from some society, and it has the insolence to suggest that this house is haunted by ghosts. Now, you know that to be false, utterly false. Yes, Miss Pendleham, said Amelia listlessly. Do I detect a hesitant note in your tone? You mean what you say, I trust? Oh, yes, Miss Pendleham. Very well. Now, this society actually wished to send down an investigator to examine and report on the house. I have replied that if any such person enters the grounds, he will be prosecuted for trespass. Here is my letter. Take it and post it at once. Very well, Miss Pendleham. You always seem so glad to get out of the house, Amelia. I wonder why. Now, make haste there, and back. A little later, Miss Amelia Lornan was hurrying down the drive of Carthwaite Place. But as soon as she knew she was out of eye-shot from its upper windows, she slackened her pace. This she did for two reasons. She was feeling terribly frail and ill that morning, and to be out of that house, even for half an hour, meant a most blessed relief from that anguish which is great fear. To reach the post office of the little hamlet, she had to pass the rectory. Mrs. Redvale, the rector's wife, was glancing out of the drawing-room window at the time. There's Amelia, she said to her husband. I've never seen her looking so ill. Poor creature. It's time you did something about her, Claude, in my opinion. She was a handsome and determined-looking woman, quite obviously wearing the trousers, and her voice was sharply authoritative. What can I do, my dear? Replied the rector with the plaintive testiness of the conscience-moved weakling. You can and must do something. You can listen to me, for one thing. I've been meaning to have this out with you for some time, ever since I realized what was going on. That sight of her convinces me it must be now at once. If she dies without our having done a hand's turn to save her, I shall never know a minute's peace again, and I don't think you will either. Come quickly, here she is going back. The rector reluctantly went to the window. What he saw brought a look of genuine distress to his kindly, diffident face. Yes, he sighed, I can see what you mean only too well. Now sit down, ordered his spouse. I know we're in a difficult position. Miss Pendleham puts £2 in the plate every Sunday, which is an enormous help to us. These are my servants' wages, she seems to say as she does it. But she is a very evil old woman. How evil, I don't think either of us fully realizes. Yet she does come to church, protested the rector. Yes, she comes to church, replied his wife sardonically, and like a great many other people for a quite ulterior motive. She wants to keep us quiet, and she bribes us to do so. Don't argue, I know I'm right. Now, we've been here only 6 months, but we've learned quite a lot in that time. We've learned that the Pendleham family have always shown a vicious, inherited streak. Drunkards, ruthless womanizers, and worse, even criminals, and just occasionally a brilliant exception. This old woman is the last of the line, and it'll be a very good thing when the horrid brood is extinct, in my opinion. Of course, said the rector, we have to trust Miles' opinion for all this really, and we know he's utterly biased against her. He won't even speak to her. He's been churchwarden here for 40 years, so he ought to know, replied Mrs. Redvale. Besides, he loses financially by his attitude. She never buys a thing at his shop. He strikes me as a perfectly honest and sincere old man, don't you think so? I must say I do. Well then, what's his story? That she was crossed in love when very young, some other woman, as she believes, stealing her man away. So she made up her mind to have revenge on her sex in her own stealthy, devilish way. He thinks her mind was permanently tainted at that time, that she is actually, if not technically, insane. It all sounds so melodramatic, murmured the rector. Melodramatic doesn't mean impossible, answered his wife sharply. There's plenty of real melodrama in the world. Now, Miles says she has had 5 companions since she marooned herself in that house 35 years ago. 3 have died there, and 2 escaped quickly, declaring Miss Pendleham was a devil and a house hell. And now there's the 6th, Amelia, and she's dying too. Dying of what? Asked the rector. Of terror, if nothing else. She could leave, like those other 2. That's so easy to say. You might say it of a rabbit in a stoat snare. When you're sufficiently frightened, you can neither run nor struggle. And she's in a hopelessly weak position, aging, penniless, naturally will-less and pliant. She'd never summon up courage to escape on her own. But she seems, in a way, to like Miss Pendleham's company, simply because she dreads being alone in that foul house. Now, you know it's haunted, Claude. My dear Clara, you put me in a most difficult position because, as you know, I agreed with Miss Pendleham that there were no such entities as ghosts. Don't be a humbug, Claude. You said that only out of politeness and a desire to please. You knew it was a lie when you said it. My dear, no, can't. You remember when we first went there, what was looking out of the window on the first floor? There seemed to be something for a moment. Was it a small boy with his face covered with blood? I got such a fleeting glimpse, my dear. Was it Miss Pendleham or Amelia? No, I suppose not. They are the only people living in the house, and I told you what I saw when I went to powder my nose. I can see it now. Do you believe me? I've never known you to tell a pointless lie. Yet a bush sometimes closely resembles a bear. But a little dead girl doesn't resemble a bush. And you heard that scream? I thought I heard something, a curious cry. It might have been a bird. A bird? How would you like to live in that house with that sort of thing? You'd even, like Amelia, prefer Miss Pendleham's company to theirs. It often makes me physically sick to think of her there. If we don't do something to save that poor woman, I shall be plagued by remorse till I die. Do me the justice, Clara, to believe that is becoming true of me also. I wonder if you realize it as I do. I'm sensitive to places like that, and always have been. The very motes in the sunbeams there seem to make beastly patterns. I don't wonder Amelia is dying by inches, has been dying for years. She told me that when they are around her, the kettle will not boil. In other words, her brain is going as her body gives up the struggle. Well, what can I do? Exclaimed the rector. Tell me, Clara. You are wiser than I in the affairs of the world, and I know more about the next. And if there is such a place? Rapped Clara. The rector sighed. I'm deeply grieved you're such a sceptic, Clara. Nonsense! Every parson should have an agnostic wife. It keeps his mind alive. Well, we'll both think it over today and discuss it again tomorrow morning. I mean tomorrow. My mind is made up. As for that £2 a week, could you go on taking it if Amelia died? Tomorrow? At 10 o'clock. You were a long time, Amelia, said Miss Pendleham. I was as quick as I could be, Miss Pendleham, but my heart was palpitating so. Nonsense, you're perfectly well. Don't imagine things, Amelia. Miss Pendleham was one of those apparently timeless spinsters. So leisurely does the process of decay take its way with them. She was very tall and cylindrical in shape, an almost epicene, sexless body. She was invariably dressed in an iridescent grey garment of antique cut and rustling train. About her face, her nose in particular, the rector had made one of his rare jests by adapting it to a Max Beerbohm pleasantry. Hints of the Iron Duke at most angles. And indeed, that ungainly, craggy feature dominated the rest. Her mouth was small, thin-lipped, dry.
Her eyes were quite round, monkey's eyes, and an odd brimstone yellow, a family stigma. Her hair was a dense grey mass. The face was a mask, as though modelled in wax from a corpse, quite colourless. Her age might have been anything from 55 to 70. Amelia was about 48. Once upon a time she might have been a bonny girl, for her features were well enough, but it required a sympathetic and perceptive eye so to scan and reconstruct the past. There are parasites which slowly devour and drain their hosts from within, till nothing is left but a thin, transparent envelope, a puff of wind, and it disintegrates. Amelia might have been long entertaining some such greedy guest. Pounds underweight, gaunt and stooping, listless and lifeless of hair and eye, like a prisoner at long last delivered from a dungeon where she had lain neglected and forgotten. Death had his hand on her shoulder, and was fast tightening his grip. But to give her her due, it had taken 9 years to bring her to this pass. I'll go and cook the luncheon, she said. Yes, what is the... chops. I'll have 3. Are you hungry? No, Miss Pendleham. Then cook 4, and let mine be red right through. Carthwaite Place rose on the northern slopes above Lake Windermere. It was unmistakably Elizabethan, a huge, sombre pile of brick with a multitude of mullioned, transomed windows and a flat roof. It had 35 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. It required many thousands spent on it to make it habitable, but that money would never be found, and it was very slowly breaking up and passing. The grounds surrounding it had gone back to a wild, disorderly nature. Miss Pendleham never left it, save to attend matins on Sunday morning. Its one trace of modernity was a telephone, used for ordering her frugal wants from the market town 6 miles away. Amelia dragged herself to the great stone vaulted kitchen and raked up the fire. She had begun to tremble again, and never did she glance behind her. Once she paused, as though listening, her face revealing the greatest anxiety. Several times her mouth moved as though she were muttering something, but no sound came. Presently she finished cooking and took the results to the dining room, where Miss Pendleham was already seated. The meal was eaten in dead silence, and very quickly, for Miss Pendleham always attacked her food like a starving panther. On the wall facing Amelia was a tattered 17th century tapestry. It depicted a company of knights and ladies riding in pairs along a sinister serpentine path. On the left of the path were 3 rotting corpses in open coffins. The air above them was thronged with vile, flying things. Amelia's eyes always flickered around the room, trying not to see it. Miss Pendleham watched her covertly. At the end of the meal she said what she always said, "Wash up quickly and come and read to me." "Very good, Miss Pendleham." When she got back to the drawing-room, Miss Pendleham handed her a book. It was a translation of the Abbé Boissard's life of Gilles de Rais, realistically illustrated. Amelia had already read it out endless times before. She read well, though the details of the abattoir ritual came oddly from her precise and virginal voice. Presently Miss Pendleham stopped her. "Something very similar," she said in her high metallic tone, "is known to have been done here by an ancestor of my own. He killed by torture a number of children, chiefly young girls, and employed their bodies for some such curious ceremonies. It is owing to that, possibly, that the house has acquired its quite false repute of being a haunted place. Perhaps I have told you that before." "Yes, Miss Pendleham," replied Amelia mechanically. "I'm going to doze now. Wake me at 5 with the tea. Sit here till it is time to prepare it." This was an ordeal Amelia detested, but had long accepted as part of her daily Calvary. Was Miss Pendleham asleep, or was she slyly watching her? Were her eyes quite closed? It was a soaking afternoon, the small dense mountain rain streaming down the windows. There was just that steady rain purr and the slow beat of the grandfather clock to break the silence. Miss Pendleham never stirred, nor did her breathing change. Slowly the light faded, and Amelia began to ache with stiffness and immobility. Suddenly, there came from somewhere in the house a thin, high cry of pain. Amelia's eyes went wide, and she put her hand to her throat. Miss Pendleham opened her eyes wide, and slowly leaned forward, staring at her. "What's the matter, Amelia?" she said, slowly. "Nothing, Miss Pendleham," gulped Amelia. "I'll go and get the tea." Miss Pendleham glanced after her, bowed back. For a moment the mask was raised, and she smiled. But the smile merely contorted the lower part of her face. Her yellow eyes took no share in it. There came again that remote, agonizing wail. The half-smile vanished. The yellow eyes flickered. The mask came down again. After tea, she played Patience, and Amelia was left to her own devices till it was time to cook the supper. Anyone watching Miss Pendleham playing Patience, which is a stark test of virtue, would have decided that if he ever did business with her, he'd have kept a sharp lawyer at his elbow, for she always cheated when necessary, but never more than necessary. Anyone who had watched Amelia presently preparing the supper by the light of 2 candles would have gleaned some understanding of the phrase mental torture. Those candles threw strange shadows on the bare walls and arched roof. That observer might have caught himself imitating Amelia, glancing up fearfully and furtively at those crowding, multiformed shades, and learned her trick of flinching when she did so. Was that a small body, lying prone, and a tall figure with its hands to the small one's throat? And did that figure move? Just the flicker of a candle, of course. And yet, that observer might well have wished himself away, but would he have had the heart to leave Amelia down there alone? Supper was again a quiet, silent meal. Miss Pendleham scraped her well-piled plates tiger clean. Amelia left her half-sparse portions. After supper, Miss Pendleham said, "Fetch my wrap from my bedroom, Amelia. I forgot to bring it down." She said that almost every evening, perhaps because she knew how Amelia dreaded going up those dark stairs, ever since she'd had that fright 4 years ago. Amelia fetched it, washed up, and returned again to the drawing-room. "Now," said Miss Pendleham, "you can read to me for an hour. Get those stories by James." "Well, Claude," said Clara next morning, "have you been thinking it over?" "Yes, my dear, but I can't see my way clear, I'm afraid. We say she tortures these women, but how does she torture them? She gives them board and lodging, pays them something, I suppose a pittance, no doubt, but something. She is superficially kind to them. She could not legally compel them to stay. Who would call that torture, save ourselves? And Mr. Miles? And Mr. Miles, if you like. Suppose I did tackle her. If she didn't at once show me the door, she'd probably call in Amelia and ask her if she had anything to complain about. No, Miss Pendleham, she'd certainly supply. And what sort of fool should I look? Mrs. Redvale, like most women in the grip of logic, raised her voice. "You've got to be firm, Claude. You're not to be fooled by that sort of thing. You must take the offensive. She can neither sack you nor eat you. Tell her straight that you are certain Amelia is dying and must have immediate attention. Remind her 3 of her companions have already died in the house, and if there's a 4th, some very awkward questions are bound to be asked. There is Amelia again. I'll get her in." She hurried from the room and out into the street. "How are you, Miss Lornan?" she asked kindly. "All right, thank you, Miss Redvale. You don't look it. Come in a moment." "Oh, I can't. Miss Pendleham told me to hurry back with the stamps." "Never mind, it's only for a minute." Amelia hesitated and then reluctantly followed her in. The rector scanned her closely as he greeted her. Mrs. Redvale now assumed her most forcible manner. "Miss Lornan, you're in a very bad state, aren't you? Don't be afraid to tell me. It'll go no further." Amelia began to cry in a most passive, hopeless way. I suppose so," she murmured. "That house is killing you, isn't it?" "Oh, I can't stand it, Mrs. Redvale." "No, you can't. Have a good cry. You've got to get away from it." "I can't. Miss Pendleton would never let me go." "She'll have to. Look here, Amelia, I'm going to call you that. We're determined to help you. In the meantime, remember, nothing there can hurt you. They can frighten. They cannot hurt." "They can," she sobbed. "They keep me awake nearly all night. In the summer it's not so bad, because they go away at dawn. But in the long nights it's terrible. I must go now. You won't have to stand it much longer. Bear up until we can do something." "There's nothing to be done. Thank you kindly, Mrs. Redvale. Oh, I mustn't say any more. Miss Pendleton would be so cross if she knew I was talking like this." "Nonsense! Your health comes before everything." But Amelia had hurried from the room. "You see," exclaimed Clara, "I could strangle that she-devil with my bare hands." "There's one thing I've never been sure about," said the rector. "Does Miss Pendleton realise there's something the matter with the house? If not, the force of the charge against her is greatly weakened." "Of course she does." "How can you be so sure?" "I watched her when we heard that ghastly cry. She heard it too. Her demeanour showed it. But it doesn't worry her. She welcomes it as an instrument of that torture. She makes Amelia think, I must be going mad if I see and hear things that aren't there. Can't you see what I mean? Her mind is diseased like that of her foul forebears. Those things are echoes of evil, and she is utterly evil too. Did the first murderer frighten the other two? Of course not. Clara, that's a frightful thing to say. You've just seen that wretched woman, haven't you? Look here, Claude. If you don't do something about it, I lose all respect for you. This is the test of your Christianity and courage. I'm an infidel, but I'd do it myself if I thought she'd take any notice of me, but she wouldn't, for she hates and despises all women. But you are her spiritual adviser. There's no need to be sarcastic, my dear. There's need to be something to goad you to action. Will you, Claude? Oh, I suppose so, sighed the rector. But I wish I could consult the bishop first. You'd get nothing but vague boomings. Is your courage at the sticking point? Yes, I'll do it. Then go straight to the phone. He left the room and returned after a few moments. She will see me at 9:30 tonight, he said. Did you tell her what you wanted to see her about? I just said something of importance. And you were understanding it's a matter of life and death, and we both know it. Have you been crying, Amelia? Oh no, Miss Pendleton. The cold wind caught my eyes. Doesn't seem cold to me. Give me the book of stamps and get luncheon ready. During the meal, Miss Pendleton said, You see that tapestry, Amelia? Yes, Miss Pendleton. You're not looking at it. Amelia glanced flinchingly up. She noticed that as each cavalier and his paramour reached the 3 open coffins, their smiles and lascivious glances changed to looks of loathing and horror. Because, she thought, they are young and happy, and haven't learned to long for rest. It's called the triumph of death, said Miss Pendleton. Yes, so you've told me. That reminds me of something. Have you finished? Yes, Miss Pendleton. Miss Pendleton led the way into the drawing-room. Today, she said, is the anniversary of the death of Miss Davis. She was my companion before you came. She was a foolish, fanciful girl in some ways. Have I told you about her before? Only a little, Miss Pendleton. Yes, she was fanciful. She used to fancy she heard and saw strange things in the house, and that shows her mind was tainted, does it not? Yes, Miss Pendleton. I mean, if the house were haunted, we should both of us see and hear such strange things, should we not? Yes, Miss Pendleton, which we never do.
No, Miss Pendleton. Of course not. Well, I should perhaps have dismissed Miss Davis earlier, but I did not like to. Have I told you how she died? No, Miss Pendleton. I thought not. I had noticed she was getting thinner and stranger in her manner, and she told me her sleep was disordered. I should have been warned when she came running to my room one day, seeing she had seen a child butchered in the kitchen, and she had other hallucinations which revealed her mind was in an abnormal state. One evening I sent her up to fetch my wrap, just as I sometimes send you, and she did not reappear. I went in search of her. I found her lying dead in the powder closet of my room. The doctor said she had died of a heart attack, and asked me if she could have had a fright of some kind. I said, not to my knowledge. I think she must have supposed she had seen something displeasing. Look behind you, Amelia. Amelia started from her chair with a cry. What is the matter with you? Said Miss Pendleton severely. I merely wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the antimacassar was slipping from your chair. I hope your nerves are not giving way. Didn't you imagine you'd had a fright of some kind a month ago? It was nothing, Miss Pendleton. You screamed loudly enough. Bear Miss Davis in mind. Becoming fanciful is often the first symptom of brain disease, so the doctor told me. Hearing things, seeing things, when there is nothing to see or hear. Now you can read to me. And this Amelia did, Miss Pendleton presently telling her to stop and seeming to doze off, while the windows rattled disconcertingly. And as the light faded, and the fire shook out its last flame and sank to its death glow, something white seemed to dart across the musician's gallery, and something follow it as though in pursuit, and there came that thin wail of pain. Amelia went rigid with terror. "What's the matter, Amelia?" said Miss Pendleton, leaning forward in her chair. "Nothing, Miss Pendleton. I'll make up the fire and then get tea." While she was cooking the dinner that night, she was thinking over what Miss Pendleton had said about Miss Davis. She had died of what was killing her, of course. She would die soon now, very soon. She knew it. And then Miss Pendleton would get someone else, and one day that someone would die too, for the same reason. Unless... Suddenly she paused in her work. What was that? Someone was crying in the servants' hall. That was something she'd never heard before. Her heart hammered in her throat, stopped horribly long, then raced away again. A piercing pain ran through her. Who was that crying? She must be brave. It might be someone real and not one of them. She took a candle and tiptoed along the passage of the hall, a bare, desolate place reeking of dirt and vermin, which Amelia dreaded and seldom entered. There was no one there, but the sound of sobbing was louder. "Oh, God!" moaned a voice. "I cannot bear it! I cannot bear it!" Then came a laugh, a sly, sinister chuckle, and the wailing voice rose to a scream. "Oh, God, I cannot bear it!" As Amelia went back to the kitchen, her face twitched violently and uncontrollably. Was that real or not? Was it just a sound in her head, as Miss Pendleton said it must be? Just a fancy? If so, she was going mad like Miss Davis. What happened to mad people in that other world? Were they mad there too? And forever? That didn't bear thinking about. She must die before that happened. She was dying. She knew that by the terrible pains in her heart. What would happen when she was dead? Miss Davis had died. She just heard her crying. No, that was just a sound in her head. Her face contorted again in the fearful effort to concentrate, to get it straight and clear in her mind. Well, she would die, like Miss Davis, and then Miss Pendleton would get someone else to look after her.
and it would all happen again with the new girl. No, it mustn't. It would not be right. Miss Pendleton was very kind, but she didn't understand about the house. It was all very curious and difficult, but it must not happen again. There was Miss Davis still crying in her head. But it would happen again unless she was brave. If Miss Pendleton realized what sort of things happened to Miss Davis and her, and what they saw and heard, she wouldn't let it happen, of course. But she didn't, and so... Did she hate Miss Pendleton? Of course not. Why should she? Again, St. Vitus racked her face. But it wouldn't happen again. There was the man and the little girl. She flung up her hands to her ears. A red veil was drawn down before her eyes. She shook her hands from the wrist and stretched and curved her fingers. The expression on her face became at once hard and vacant, like that of a beast at bay. She retained that curious, inhuman expression, and Miss Pendleton noticed it when she brought up the meal. It disturbed her, and her own eyes went weasel hard. Presently she said, "Eat your dinner, Amelia. What is the matter with you?" "Nothing, Miss Pendleton. I'm not very hungry." "Eat your food. By the way, you haven't been talking to the rector or his wife, have you?" I just said good morning to Mrs. Redveil." "Are you sure that was all?" "Yes, Miss Pendleton." And then there was silence for a while, till Miss Pendleton rose and remarked, "You can read to me for a while." And Amelia read out a tale about some bedclothes forming into a figure and frightening an old man in the other bed. "What did you think of that, Amelia?" asked Miss Pendleton. "Very nice, Miss Pendleton." "Nice! I don't believe you're paying attention. You read very badly again." "I'm sorry, Miss Pendleton. The old man was mad, wasn't he, Miss Pendleton? Like Miss Davis. And me." Miss Pendleton stared at her. "Get my wrap," she said brutally. Amelia got up slowly and went through the door leading to the stairs. As she started to climb them, she crossed herself and stretched and curved her fingers. A fearful twitch convulsed her face. Miss Pendleton went to the front door, opened it and left it ajar, and went back to the drawing-room. Then, as the minutes passed, she cocked her head as though listening. There came that high torture wail, and she straightened her head abruptly. The clock ticked, the windows throbbed and hammered in the gale. Presently she got up and went to the foot of the stairs. "Amelia!" she called, her voice cracking oddly. There was no reply. She smiled and ran her thick tongue along her lips. She went up a few stairs and called again, then fetched a lighted candle from the drawing-room and ascended to the first landing. "Amelia!" she called. A sudden fierce gust of wind spurted down the passage and blew out the candle, leaving her in pitch darkness. She began to grope her way down the corridor, her fingers sliding along the wall. They came to a gap, and she turned in to the left, moving forward till her thighs met a bed. "Amelia!" she called, and the echo was hurled hard back at her. She moved across the room, her hands groping out before her till they found another gap, the powder closet. This was crammed with her ancient and discarded clothes, and stank of stale scent, sweat, and decay. She touched a hanging frock and then another, her hands moving along. And then her right hand met something, and she drew in her breath with a quickness. The next second she was twisting and writhing, and from her lips came a choked scream as she was ruthlessly drawn in among the reeking stuffs. Swinging wildly on their hooks, she struck out blindly with her clenched fists again and again. At last she leaned forward, buckling at the knees. Her arms fell quivering to her sides. There was a long, vile rattle from her throat, and she was still. "It's 9:15, said Clara. "Time you're off.
You'd better have a drink before you go. It'll help you be firm. And you've got to be very firm." She poured out a stiff whisky, which the rector gulped down. Then he picked up his hat and coat and set out. It had stopped raining, but it was still blowing a full gale, and he had to fight his way against it. So soon as he entered the drive through the battered gates screeching on their hinges, he felt his nerves a-tingle, as one who on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread. The old lines leaped to his memory. He glanced fearfully up at the overhanging boughs. Was that a footstep close behind him? He broke into a run. To his surprise, he found the front door half open and went in. He saw a light in the drawing-room, entered and found it empty. He waited a few moments and then called timorously out, I'm here, Miss Pendleham." Before the echo of his voice died away, there came a long, choked scream. "Good God, what was that?" he muttered, and sweat broke out on him. It came from above. I must go up. He glanced distractedly around, picked up a candlestick, lit the candle, and opened the door to the stairs with a quivering hand. As he hurried up the first flight, it seemed to him there was something astir in the house, and that the shadows on the wall came from a company of persons following him up, and that others were awaiting him on the landing. He trembled, and his breath came fast. "Miss Pendleham," he quavered. No sound. He lurched down the corridor till he came to an open door, through which he passed into a huge room. He raised the candlestick and peered fearfully about him. There was another door, open, and there was Miss Pendleham. "Here I am, Miss Pendleham," he said. What was she doing? He could only see her body from the waist down. The rest was buried in some clothes. He tiptoed into the closet and gingerly pulled the clothes aside. And then he sprang back with a clipped cry, for he was gazing into the battered, dead face of Amelia Lornan. She was leaning back against the wall, and she had drawn Miss Pendleham's head down on her breast. Her hands clutched her neck so fiercely, and the nails were driven in so deep that the blood was seeping down over her lace collar. The last shred of self-control left him. The candlestick fell from his hand, and he ran blunderingly from the room and down the stairs. The air seemed full of screams and laughter. Something death-cold was pressed against his face. Leaping figures ran beside him, till at last he staggered, whimpering, out into the night.